Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. The cemetery gates stood open despite the late hour, their wrought iron bars casting twisted shadows across the gravel path that wound between ancient headstones. I shouldn't have been there at midnight. Visiting hours ended at sunset, but my insomnia had driven me from my apartment again, and walking among the graves had always helped quiet the restless thoughts that kept me awake. Greenwood Cemetery had been my refuge for the better part of a year now, ever since the incident at work that had led to my medical leave. The doctors called it a stress-induced breakdown, but that clinical terminology felt inadequate to describe the way reality had seemed to fracture around me during those final weeks of trying to maintain a normal life. The medication helped mostly. The anxiolytic kept the panic attacks at bay, and the mood stabilizer prevented the worst of the emotional swings that had characterized my descent into whatever this was. But sleep remained elusive, and the prescribed sleeping pills left me groggy and disoriented the next day. So I walked instead, finding peace among the departed that I couldn't find among the living. My favorite section lay toward the back of the cemetery, where the oldest graves stood in neat rows beneath towering oak trees. The headstones here dated back to the 1800s. Their carved inscriptions softened by decades of weather, but still legible in the moonlight. I knew most of them by heart now. Sarah Mitchell, beloved wife and mother 1834-1867, Jonathan Harrow, devoted son 1848-1871, the entire Whitman family, claimed by the cholera epidemic of 1885. These were my nocturnal companions, silent witnesses to my midnight wanderings. Their presence felt comforting rather than morbid. They had found the peace that continued to elude me, had moved beyond the anxieties and uncertainties that plagued the living. Tonight felt different, though. The air was thick with the promise of rain, heavy with moisture that made every sound seem muffled and distant. My footsteps on the gravel path seemed unnaturally loud, each crunch echoing off the surrounding headstones like whispers between the dead. I followed my usual route, weaving between the familiar graves. But as I approached the Whitman family plot, I noticed something that made me stop short. There was a new headstone among the old ones, fresh granite that gleamed pale in the moonlight, its surface unmarked by age or weather. This was impossible. I'd been walking this section every night for months. I knew every stone, every inscription, every weathered angel and carved flower that decorated the graves. There had been no new burial here, no funeral procession or freshly turned earth to mark a recent interment. Yet the stone stood among its companions as if it had always been there, as natural and permanent as the century-old monuments surrounding it. I approached slowly, my heart beginning to beat faster with that familiar flutter of anxiety that preceded my worst episodes. The inscription was carved in clear, precise letters that seemed to glow in the pale light. Eoxanar Geishtan BLVDAU Eoxar 1989-2024, my name, my birth year, and a death date that was still 10 months in the future. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the uneven ground, and nearly fell into the Harrow grave behind me. This had to be some kind of mistake, a coincidence, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by the stress of my condition and the late hour. But as I stared at the stone, I could see other details that made my throat constrict with fear. Beneath the dates was a small inscription in a script I recognized as my own handwriting. "She found peace at last." Those were words I'd written in my journal just that morning, describing what I hoped to achieve through my treatment and recovery. Words that no one else could have seen, that existed only in my private thoughts and on a page in my apartment. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands, its screen casting harsh blue light across the graveyard around me. The camera app opened with a soft chime, and I aimed it at the impossible headstone, needing to capture evidence of what I was seeing. But when I looked at the photo I'd just taken, the space where the stone stood appeared empty. The other graves were clearly visible, the Whitmans, the Harrows, all the familiar monuments, but where my headstone should have been, there was only empty grass. I lowered the phone and looked directly at the spot. The stone was still there, solid and real, its inscription as clear as before. When I raised the phone again, the viewfinder showed empty space. My hands began to shake more violently, and I had to lean against the nearest headstone to keep from falling. This was worse than my previous episodes, worse than the disorientation and panic attacks that had led to my breakdown. This was a complete break from consensus reality, the kind of psychotic episode I'd feared since my diagnosis. But even as my rational mind offered explanations, stress, medication side effects, sleep deprivation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else entirely. The stone felt real in a way that hallucinations shouldn't, solid and present and permanent. I forced myself to approach it again, to reach out and touch its surface. The granite was cold under my fingertips, rough with the texture of newly carved stone. When I pressed my palm against it, I could feel the slight indentations where the letters had been cut into the rock. The date stared back at me, 2024, 10 months from now, October 15th, to be exact. A Tuesday, according to the mental calendar I kept obsessively organized despite my other psychological difficulties. October 15th. The same date my therapist had circled in red on the calendar in her office, marking what she called my progress evaluation meeting. The day we would determine whether I was ready to return to normal life or needed extended treatment. The coincidence was too specific to dismiss, but what could it mean? That I was going to die on the day I was supposed to get better. That my recovery would somehow lead to my death. I tried to photograph the stone again, but the result was the same. Empty space where I could see solid granite. Whatever this was, it existed only for me, visible only to my perception. That should have been comforting, should have confirmed that this was a psychological phenomenon rather than something supernatural. Instead, it made me feel more isolated than ever. I sat down on the grass beside the impossible grave, my legs too unsteady to support me any longer. The night air was growing cooler, and I could smell rain approaching on the wind. Soon I would have to leave, return to my apartment, and try to convince myself that this had been nothing more than another symptom of my deteriorating mental health. But as I sat there, staring at my own name carved in stone, I began to notice other changes in the cemetery around me. The shadows between the headstones seemed deeper now, more substantive, as if they were gaining weight and presence in the darkness. And the silence that I'd always found comforting had taken on a different quality. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and patient waiting. The carved inscription caught my attention again. She found peace at last. Past tense. As if my search for tranquility had already concluded. But I was still searching, still struggling with the anxiety and depression that had derailed my life. The peace I sought remained elusive, perhaps impossible. Unless the peace the headstone referred to wasn't the kind achieved through therapy and medication. Unless it was the permanent peace that came only with death. I shook my head, trying to dispel that line of thinking. Suicidal ideation was dangerous territory for someone in my condition, a path that led only to darker thoughts and worse outcomes. My therapist had been very clear about the warning signs I needed to watch for. But the stone seemed to pulse in the moonlight, drawing my attention back to that impossible date, October 15th. The day that was supposed to mark my return to normalcy, now carved as the day of my death. What if they were the same thing? What if the only way to find peace, to escape the endless cycle of anxiety and medication and careful monitoring, was to accept the ultimate solution? The thought came with a seductive clarity that scared me more than any hallucination could. This was how it happened. Not with dramatic crisis or sudden impulse, but with quiet logic and the gradual acceptance of the inevitable. The stone wasn't predicting my death, it was offering it as a choice. I stood up abruptly, backing away from the grave again. This was exactly the kind of thinking I needed to report to my doctor. The kind of ideation that required immediate intervention. But even as I recognized the danger, I couldn't stop looking at the headstone, couldn't shake the sense that it was calling to me. The rain began as scattered drops that pattered against the leaves overhead, but quickly intensified into a steady downpour that soaked through my jacket and sent rivulets of water running between the graves. I should have left then, should have run for shelter and put as much distance as possible between myself and this impossible monument to my own mortality. Instead, I found myself walking closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The stone seemed to shine more brightly in the rain, its surface reflecting the occasional flash of lightning that split the sky overhead. As I approached, new details became visible in the strengthening storm light. There were flowers at the base of the headstone, fresh roses that shouldn't have survived the rain, their petals perfect and unblemished, and beside them, a small photograph in a waterproof frame. The photograph showed me smiling, but it was a picture I'd never seen before. I was older in the image, perhaps by several years, and there was something different about my expression. A calmness, a sense of resolution that I'd never managed to achieve in real life. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note, protected by the same impossible waterproofing that kept the roses fresh. The writing was unmistakably mine, but the words were ones I'd never written. To those who find this, I chose my own peace. The date was always going to be October 15th, 2024. I've just been waiting for the courage to accept it. My legs gave out entirely, and I collapsed to my knees in the muddy grass beside the grave. The note was dated today's date, written in my own handwriting, describing a decision I hadn't made and didn't remember considering. But even as I stared at the impossible evidence of my own future suicide, I felt something that surprised me more than fear or confusion. I felt relief. The constant struggle, the endless appointments and medications, and careful monitoring of my mood and behavior, all of it could end. The date was already chosen, the method already decided. All I had to do was accept what the stone was showing me, embrace the peace it promised. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in its stark illumination I saw something that made my blood freeze. There were other stones around me now, dozens of them, all bearing the same date but different names. Other people who had found this place, who had seen their own mortality carved in stone and chosen to accept it. The cemetery had become a garden of predetermined deaths. Each grave a promise of peace for those who lacked the strength to continue living. And I was just the latest visitor to receive the invitation. But as I knelt there in the rain, staring at my own name carved in granite, I realized something that cut through the seductive logic of the stone's promise. The photograph showed me older, which meant I had years left to live before that October date. Years that could still hold possibilities I hadn't considered, experiences I hadn't imagined. The stone wasn't showing me my inevitable future. It was showing me one possible future, trying to convince me that it was the only option available. I forced myself to stand, to back away from the grave despite the pull I felt toward its promise of eternal rest. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the mud from my knees and sending streams of water running between the headstones. As I retreated, I watched the impossible stone begin to fade, its solid granite becoming translucent in the storm light. The roses wilted and crumbled. The photograph dissolved into illegible smears, and the carved inscription grew dim and uncertain. By the time I reached the cemetery gates, looking back over my shoulder, there was nothing there but empty grass between the genuine graves of people who had lived full lives before finding their rest. The stone had been a test, I realized, not of my sanity, but of my will to live. And I had passed, barely, by choosing uncertainty over the false certainty of predetermined death. October 15th would come eventually, just 10 months in the future. But when it did, I would be sitting in my therapist's office, discussing my progress and planning for the years ahead. The date would mark not my death, but my return to life, my rejection of the easy answers that darkness offered. The rain followed me home, washing away the mud and fear and leaving me clean for whatever genuine peace I might find among the living. Because sometimes the only way to find rest is to keep walking, even when the stones whisper your name in the darkness and promise that the journey could end before it truly begins. The dead, after all, have eternity to rest. The living have only the time they're given to discover what peace really means. Story 2. The 11:15 p.m. bus was never crowded. That was the beauty of working the night shift at the hospital, while everyone else was settling into their evening routines. I was just beginning my journey home. Route 47 ran from downtown to the suburbs every 20 minutes after 11, carrying the dregs of the day shift and the early birds of the graveyard crew. I knew the regular passengers by sight, if not by name. The security guard with the thermos of coffee, who always sat 3 seats from the front. The cleaning lady who dozed against the window with her head wrapped in a bright yellow scarf. The college student who marked up textbooks with a yellow highlighter, the fluorescent ink glowing under the bus's harsh interior lighting. But on that Thursday in November, something was different. I climbed the steps as usual, feeding my transit card into the reader and hearing the familiar beep of acceptance. The bus was about half full, normal for this time of night. But as I walked down the aisle looking for a seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The faces. I couldn't see any of their faces clearly. Not that they were hidden or obscured exactly. The passengers were all there, sitting in their usual spots, going through their familiar motions. But their features seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them, like looking at someone through water or trying to remember a dream that's already fading. I chose a seat halfway back and settled in for the 40-minute ride home. Outside, the city rolled past in its typical late night rhythm, streetlights and neon signs creating a strobing pattern against the dark windows. I pulled out my phone to check messages, but the screen seemed unusually bright in the dim interior of the bus. When I looked up again, I noticed that the passenger across the aisle was staring at me. At least, I thought he was staring. His head was turned in my direction, and there was a sense of focused attention, but I couldn't make out his eyes, or his nose, or his mouth. Just a vague impression of a face, like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. I shifted in my seat, suddenly self-conscious. Had I been staring first? Was this some kind of confrontation brewing? But when I tried to catch his eye, to offer an apologetic nod or a small smile, there was nothing there to connect with. Just that indistinct oval where a face should be. Don't be ridiculous, I told myself. You're tired. You've been pulling double shifts all week. Your eyes are just strained. But as the bus swayed and lurched through the downtown streets, I began to notice that all the passengers shared this same quality. Their bodies were solid enough I could see the fabric of their clothes, the way they shifted and moved with the bus's motion. But their faces remained stubbornly out of focus. The security guard lifted his thermos to drink, and I watched the motion carefully. The cup met something. There was the sound of swallowing, the slight movement of a throat, but no visible lips, no discernible mouth. Just a warm, flesh-colored blur where features should have been. My heart began to beat faster. This wasn't eye strain. This was something else entirely. I pulled out my phone again and opened the camera app, pretending to take a selfie while actually aiming the lens at the passengers around me. Through the phone screen, they looked normal, perfectly normal. I could see every detail of their faces, the security guard's graying mustache, the cleaning lady's worn expression, the student's concentrated frown. But when I lowered the phone and looked with my naked eyes, the blurring returned immediately. Stay calm, I told myself. There's a logical explanation. Maybe it's a neurological issue. Maybe you're having some kind of episode. The bus pulled to a stop at 5th and Morrison. The doors wheezed open with a hydraulic sigh, and several passengers got off. New ones got on, a man in a business suit, a woman carrying grocery bags, a teenager with headphones around his neck, and they all had the same problem, the same impossible, unfocusable faces. I watched the newcomers find their seats, listened to their normal sounds, the rustle of clothing, the creak of the bus's plastic seats, the occasional cough or cleared throat. Everything seemed ordinary except for this one crucial detail. The woman with the grocery bags sat directly in front of me. I could see her black coat, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, the way she carefully arranged her bags on the seat beside her. But when she turned to glance back at me, and I was certain she was looking at me, there was nothing there to see. Just that same maddening blur. Maybe I should get off, I thought. Take a taxi home, see a doctor tomorrow. But the next stop wasn't for another 10 minutes. And something told me that leaving the bus wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't a problem with the bus or the passengers. This was a problem with me. Or maybe it wasn't a problem at all. Maybe it was just new. I tried an experiment. Closing my eyes, I listened to the sounds around me. The diesel engine's low rumble, the squeak and sway of the suspension. Conversations in half a dozen languages, though the words seemed strangely distant and indistinct. And underneath it all, a sound I'd never noticed before, a soft, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everyone at once. When I opened my eyes, the security guard was standing in the aisle next to my seat. "Excuse me," he said, though I couldn't see his mouth move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like a radio playing in another room. "Is this your stop coming up?" I looked out the window. We were approaching Elm Street, still 20 minutes from my usual stop. "No," I said. "I go all the way to the end, eh?" He remained standing there, swaying slightly with the bus's motion. "The end." "Yes, we all go to the end eventually." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry about. We all have our destinations. Some of us just take longer to reach them." He moved away, back to his seat near the front, but I could feel his attention still focused on me. In fact, I was beginning to realize that all of them were watching me. Every passenger on the bus, despite their lack of visible eyes, was somehow aware of my presence in a way that felt urgent and immediate. The bus pulled away from the Elm Street stop, and I noticed we were traveling faster now. The streetlights outside were beginning to blur together, creating long streams of yellow and white against the dark windows. But the passengers remained perfectly still, as if unaffected by the increased speed. "First time?" asked the woman with the grocery bags, turning to face me fully. "First time what?" "Seeing us. Really seeing us." I gripped the armrest of my seat tighter. "I don't understand." "You do, though. Deep down, you understand perfectly." Her voice was kind, almost maternal. "It's frightening at first, the not seeing. But you'll get used to it." "Get used to what?" "I don't." "The transition," said the college student, looking up from his textbook. "It's different for everyone. Some people take months. Others adapt in a matter of days." "Transition to what?" My voice was getting higher, more strained. Several other passengers had turned to watch our conversation, their featureless faces somehow conveying interest and sympathy. "To being like us," the security guard called from the front. "To traveling the route. To going where we go." The bus was definitely moving faster now. The world outside had become a solid blur of motion and light, but inside, everything remained calm and normal. The passengers swayed gently with the movement, their conversations continuing in low, comfortable tones. "I want to get off," I said, standing abruptly. "I want to get off at the next stop." "There are no more stops," the woman with the grocery bags said gently. "Not for you. Not anymore." I looked toward the front of the bus, where the driver should have been. There was someone there, a figure in the appropriate uniform, hands on the wheel. But like the passengers, his face was an indistinct blur, and when I tried to read the destination sign above the windshield, the letters seemed to shift and rearrange themselves before I could make sense of them. "This isn't my bus," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. This was definitely Route 47. These were definitely the same seats I'd been sitting in for months. The same advertisements for local businesses, the same worn patches in the upholstery, the same faint smell of diesel and industrial disinfectant. "It's always been your bus," the teenager with the headphones said. "You just weren't ready to see it clearly before." I stumbled down the aisle toward the front, pushing past passengers who felt solid enough, but whose faces remained maddeningly out of focus. "Let me off," I called to the driver. "Let me off right now." But the driver didn't respond. Couldn't respond, maybe, because now that I was close enough to see clearly, I realized that he didn't have a face either, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin where eyes and nose and mouth should have been. "I can't hear you," the security guard said kindly. "None of us can hear each other, really. We sense intentions, feelings, thoughts. It's better than hearing once you get used to it." I pressed my hands against the cold window of the bus, watching the world streak past in impossible colors. We were traveling so fast now that physics should have torn us apart. But somehow the bus held together, carrying us toward some destination I couldn't name or imagine. "Where are we going?" I whispered. "Home," said the cleaning lady, speaking for the first time. "We're all going home. But this isn't the way home. This isn't the right road." "It's the only road," she replied. "The only one that matters." I sank into the seat behind the driver, defeated and confused. Through the side windows, I could see we were no longer in the city at all. The landscape outside was dark and featureless, broken only by the occasional light that might have been a star or might have been something else entirely. "How long have you been on this bus?" I asked the security guard. "Time doesn't work the same way here," he said. "Could be hours, could be years. Does it matter?" "It matters to me. It will matter less and less as you adjust. The urgency fades. The need to be somewhere else, to be someone else. This becomes enough. This becomes everything." I tried to call Sarah on my phone, but there was no signal. The screen showed no bars, no carrier name, no indication that we were anywhere within range of civilization. But the time still ticked forward, 11:47 p.m., 11:48 p.m., 11:49 p.m., as if somewhere in the world, normal time continued its normal progression. I said, "Oh." Sarah, my wife, "When I don't come home." The passengers exchanged what might have been glances, though it was impossible to tell with their blurred features. "You are home," the woman with the grocery bags said finally. "This is where you belong, where we all belong." "I belong in my house," with my wife in my bed, do you? Think carefully. When was the last time you felt truly present there? Truly connected? When was the last time you felt like you were exactly where you were supposed to be? The question hit me harder than I expected. When was the last time? Had I ever felt completely at ease in my own life, in my own skin? Or had I always been waiting for something else? Somewhere else, someone else to make everything make sense? I felt it on the bus, I said quietly, and immediately wished I hadn't spoken. Exactly. The student closed his textbook with a soft snap. The bus was always the most real part of your day. The only time you felt genuinely yourself. He was right. God help me, he was right. The daily commute had been my sanctuary, my thinking time, my transition between the artificial world of work and the complicated world of home. On the bus, I existed in a pure state, not the hospital technician, not the husband, not the son or brother or friend. Just myself, moving through space, observing and being observed. But this isn't right, I protested weakly. This isn't normal. Normal is overrated, the cleaning lady said. Normal is exhausting. Normal is a performance we put on for people who aren't really watching anyway. Sarah watches. Sarah sees what she expects to see. What she needs to see. Just like you saw our faces clearly when you stopped trying so hard to understand them. I looked around the bus again, at all these passengers who had somehow become my companions in this impossible journey. And I realized that while I still couldn't see their features clearly, I was beginning to sense something else about them, their personalities, their histories, their fundamental selves beneath the surface blur. The security guard was lonely but dignified, carrying decades of small disappointments with quiet grace. The cleaning lady was stronger than she appeared, worn down by circumstances, but never truly broken. The student was searching for something he couldn't name, using education as a map for an unmappable territory, and they could sense the same things about me. My restlessness, my feeling of being slightly out of phase with the world, my secret relief at being away from all the places where I was supposed to fit but never quite did. "We're not really passengers, are we?" I said. No, the woman with the grocery bags agreed. We're more like refugees. From what? From the burden of being someone specific. From the exhaustion of maintaining an identity. From the loneliness of being trapped inside a single perspective. The bus began to slow. Through the windshield, I could see lights approaching, not the harsh fluorescent glow of city streets, but something softer and warmer. A station, perhaps, or a terminal. "Is this where we get off?" I asked. "This is where we arrive," the driver said, speaking for the first time. His voice was exactly what I expected it to be, familiar, comforting, like coming home after a long absence. But we don't get off. We simply are. The bus pulled to a stop with its characteristic wheeze and shudder. The doors opened, but instead of the usual view of sidewalks and streetlights, there was only a gentle, welcoming darkness beyond. "Will I see Sarah again?" I asked. "You'll see her the way she really is," the security guard said. "Not the version you projected onto her, or the version she performed for you, her actual self, free from the constraints of being a specific person in a specific relationship." That sounds terrifying. "It's beautiful," the cleaning lady assured me. "Everything is beautiful when you stop trying to control it." One by one, the passengers began to stand, not to leave, but to acknowledge that we had arrived wherever we were going. I stood too, though my legs felt uncertain beneath me. Through the open doors came a sound, the breathing I'd noticed earlier, but louder now, more distinct. It was the sound of countless people exhaling in unison, releasing the effort of being individual, separate, defined. "Will it hurt?" I asked. "No more than it already has," the teenager said. "Probably less." I took a step toward the door, then another. The other passengers moved with me, and I realized we were all walking in perfect synchronization, breathing at the same rhythm, existing in the same expanded moment. Just before I reached the threshold, I felt my phone buzz with a text message. Sarah, checking to see if I'd made it home safely. I looked at the screen for a long moment, at her name and number, and the little heart emoji she always included. Then I dropped the phone and stepped off the bus into the waiting darkness, where all the faces were beautifully, perfectly clear. Story 3. The rhythm started as it always did, one foot, then the other, finding that familiar cadence that would carry me through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. My evening run had become a ritual over the past months, a way to clear the accumulated stress of the day and tire my body enough to ensure sleep would come easily. But tonight felt different from the moment I stepped out of my apartment building. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, casting pools of amber light that somehow felt less reassuring than they should. The familiar sounds of the evening, distant traffic, television audio leaking from apartment windows, the occasional bark of a dog, all seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened to absorb sound. I stretched briefly against a lamp post, working through the routine that had become automatic over months of regular running. Left calf, right calf, hamstrings, quads. My muscles responded with the familiar mixture of tightness and potential energy that meant they were ready for the work ahead. I started slowly, as always, letting my body warm into the motion. Left foot, right foot, breathing settling into the rhythm that would sustain me for the next 30 minutes. The pavement was dry, and even beneath my shoes, offering the reliable grip that let me focus on pace rather than footing. It was 3 blocks into the run that I first heard them, footsteps that weren't mine, matching my pace with uncanny precision. Not the irregular rhythm of another jogger, coincidentally running the same route, but an exact mirror of my own stride. When I sped up slightly to test a theory, the steps behind me accelerated to match. When I slowed, they slowed with me, maintaining perfect synchronization. I turned to look over my shoulder, expecting to see another runner who had perhaps decided to pace themselves against me. The street behind me was empty, illuminated by the same dim streetlights, showing nothing but pavement and parked cars and the shadows they cast. But the footsteps continued. I stopped completely, turning around to scan the area more carefully. The sound stopped as well, leaving only the quiet hum of the city at rest. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing except my own breathing and the distant whisper of traffic from the main boulevard several blocks away. When I resumed running, the footsteps resumed as well. This time, I tried to analyze the sound more carefully. The steps seemed to come from directly behind me, maybe 10 feet back, matching not just my pace, but the specific impact pattern of my gait. I could hear the initial contact of heel against pavement, the slight scruff as weight transferred to the toe, the brief silence as the foot lifted for the next stride. It was exactly the sound my own feet were making. I experimented with changes in my running style, shifting from heel strike to mid, foot landing, then to a more pronounced toe, first approach. Each time, the phantom footsteps adjusted to match, replicating not just my timing, but the subtle variations in sound that came with different techniques. The thought occurred to me that I might be hearing an echo, some acoustic trick created by the arrangement of buildings and parked cars that was reflecting my own footfalls back to my ears with a slight delay. But echoes didn't work that way. They came from ahead or to the sides, bouncing off surfaces and returning with diminished volume. They didn't follow behind with perfect clarity and timing. I turned down a side street, hoping to change the acoustic environment and see if the phenomenon continued. The new route took me past a row of small houses set back from the sidewalk, each with its own front yard and individual landscaping. Different surfaces, different angles, different potential for sound reflection. The footsteps followed me around the corner without missing a beat. More unsettling, they seemed to be getting closer. What had started as a 10-foot separation now felt like 6 feet, maybe less. I could hear more detail now, the slight squeak of sole against pavement that my shoes made when they were getting worn, the faint swish of fabric as legs moved in running motion, even what might have been controlled breathing. But when I turned to look, there was still nothing behind me except empty sidewalk. I picked up the pace, pushing harder than I usually did during my evening runs. My heart rate climbed, and my breathing deepened. But along with the familiar sensations of increased effort came the sound of another runner, pushing just as hard. The phantom, breathing matched my own elevated rhythm, and the footsteps quickened to mirror my increased stride rate. Whoever or whatever was following me was not just matching my movements, but somehow sharing my exertion, experiencing the same physiological responses to the same changes in pace and effort. I tried stopping suddenly, hoping to catch my pursuer off guard. But again, the footsteps ceased the instant mine did, with no overstep, no gradual deceleration. No sign that whoever was behind me had been surprised by the change. During the silence, I became aware of other sounds that seemed wrong. The ambient noise of the neighborhood, the background hum that usually faded into unconsciousness during a run, was absent. No air conditioning units cycling on and off, no television audio, no distant conversations or music. It was as if the entire area had been emptied of human activity, except for myself and my invisible companion. When I started running again, I tried a different approach. Instead of looking back, I focused on listening forward, trying to detect any sounds from ahead that might indicate I was running towards something, rather than away from it. But the path ahead seemed as empty as the path behind, offering only the repetitive percussion of my feet and their perfect echo. I turned another corner, this time onto a street I had never explored before. It was darker here, with fewer streetlights and more mature trees that blocked what little illumination the cloudy sky provided. But familiar or not, it was still just a street in my neighborhood, lined with houses where people lived normal lives and went to sleep at reasonable hours. The footsteps followed me into the darkness, and now I could hear something else mixed in with their rhythm. Breathing, definitely, but not just the controlled exhalation of aerobic exercise. There was something more complex happening, occasional deeper breaths, the kind that came with emotional stress or physical strain beyond mere exertion. My invisible companion was experiencing something more than just a run. As we continued through the darker section of the route, I began to notice that the footsteps weren't just behind me anymore. Sometimes they seemed to be beside me, matching my stride in perfect parallel motion. Other times they appeared to come from slightly ahead, as if something was leading rather than following. But no matter where the sound seemed to originate, I remained alone on the sidewalk. The thought crossed my mind that I might be experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination, stress, fatigue, or some underlying health issue creating phantom sounds that seemed real, but had no external source. I had heard of such things happening to people under various conditions, and running at night in unfamiliar areas could certainly provide enough psychological stress to trigger unusual perceptual experiences. But the sounds were too detailed, too consistent, too perfectly matched to my own movements to be mere hallucinations. There was a quality to them that felt objectively real, as if they were being produced by an actual presence that simply couldn't be seen. I decided to head back toward more familiar and well-lit areas, retracing my route through the neighborhood I knew better. But as I turned around, I realized I was no longer certain which direction led home. The streets looked different somehow, not dramatically changed, but subtly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing them from an angle I had never noticed before. The house numbers, when I could make them out in the dim light, didn't follow the patterns I expected. What should have been 1247 was labeled 1274, and the next house bore the number 1249, creating a sequence that violated the logical progression of addressing systems. But the footsteps behind me continued with unwavering consistency, and I found myself taking comfort in their presence despite not understanding their source. Whatever was creating those sounds had been with me for the entire run, matching my pace through every change in route and rhythm. In a strange way, it felt less like being followed by a threat and more like being accompanied by someone who understood exactly what I was experiencing. I stopped trying to lose my companion and instead focused on finding my way back to recognizable landmarks. But the longer I ran, the more convinced I became that I was moving through a version of my neighborhood that was somehow different from the one I had left when I started my run. The changes were subtle but accumulating. Street names that were almost but not quite right. Familiar houses with small architectural details that didn't match my memories. Traffic signs that conveyed the same information, but with slightly different wording or font choices. It was as if I were running through a carefully constructed replica of my actual neighborhood, accurate in most respects, but created by someone who was working from photographs rather than direct experience. Someone who understood the general layout, but had to guess at some of the finer details. The footsteps behind me seemed to know this route perfectly, never hesitating at intersections, never showing any uncertainty about direction. Whatever was creating those sounds had been here before, many times, and knew exactly where we were going even if I did not. After what felt like an hour of running, but according to my fitness tracker, had been only 23 minutes, I finally saw something I recognized with absolute certainty. My apartment building, illuminated by the same exterior lights that had been on when I left, looking exactly as it should look. But as I approached the entrance, I realized that the footsteps were no longer behind me. Somewhere in the last few blocks, my invisible companion had either stopped following or had ceased to exist. The night was filled only with the normal sounds of urban and evening distant traffic, air conditioning units, the faint murmur of human activity from behind lit windows. I stopped at the building's entrance and turned back to look at the route I had just completed. The street appeared perfectly normal now, with familiar house numbers in their proper sequence and streetlights providing adequate illumination. It was as if the strange version of my neighborhood had been replaced by the genuine article the moment I reached my destination. But as I stretched against the building's brick facade, working through my post-run routine, I heard something that made me pause mid-stretch. Footsteps approaching from the direction I had just come, maintaining the same pace I had been running, creating the same specific pattern of sounds that my own feet produced. I looked up the street and saw myself running toward the building, still several blocks away, but clearly visible under the streetlights. Another version of myself, wearing the same clothes, maintaining the same pace, following the same route I had just completed. The approaching runner seemed unaware of my presence, focused entirely on the path ahead, breathing with the controlled rhythm of someone in the middle of a regular evening workout. As he drew closer, I could see that his face held the same expression of mild concern I remembered feeling during my own run, the look of someone who was hearing sounds that didn't quite make sense, but wasn't yet ready to admit that something was fundamentally wrong. He passed by the building without seeing me, continuing on down the street toward whatever destination his version of the run was supposed to reach. But I could hear, fading behind him as he moved away, the sound of another set of footsteps matching his pace exactly. He had a companion too. I went inside and took the elevator to my apartment, where I found my door unlocked and the lights on, though I was certain I had locked up and turned everything off before leaving for my run. On the kitchen table was a note written in my own handwriting. Did you enjoy the company? Same time tomorrow. Below that, in slightly different handwriting but still recognizably mine, the road gets easier once you stop trying to lose me. I know all the shortcuts. And below that, in handwriting that was definitely mine, but seemed somehow younger, we've been running together longer than you remember. Check your fitness tracker. Look at the data from runs you think you took alone. I pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled through weeks of recorded workouts. Every single run showed the same anomaly in the data GPS tracking that indicated I had covered exactly twice the distance I remembered running. Heart rate patterns that suggested I had been maintaining two different paces simultaneously. Step counts that were perfectly divisible by 2, as if the device had been recording the movements of 2 runners instead of 1. According to my phone, I had never run alone. Tonight, when I lace up my shoes and head out for my evening run, I know I'll hear the footsteps again. But this time, I think I'll try talking to whoever is making them. After all, we've been running together for months. It seems rude that we haven't been formally introduced. The only question remaining is whether I'm the one following or the one being followed, and whether it matters, as long as we both reach the same destination in the end. The footsteps will be there, matching my pace exactly, sharing my route and my effort, and perhaps my destination. And maybe, if I listen carefully enough, I'll finally hear something other than the sound of running. Maybe I'll hear the sound of someone trying to tell me why they never run alone either, and where they think we've been going all this time, and whether they remember choosing to run this route, or if they, like me, just found themselves here one evening with no clear memory of how the journey began. Some running companions, I'm learning, are more persistent than others, and some races have finish lines that can only be reached by runners who don't mind sharing their stride with someone they've never seen, but somehow know better than they know themselves. Story 4. The morning commute had settled into its familiar rhythm when the announcement began. I was standing near the doors of the subway car, swaying gently with the train's motion, lost in that comfortable half-consciousness that comes with routine. The metallic voice of the automated system crackled through the speakers as it always did, announcing the next station with mechanical precision. But then something changed. Now approaching Roosevelt Avenue, the voice said, and I felt the world tilt sideways. It was my voice. Not as it sounded now, deeper, rougher from years of coffee and late nights, but as it had been when I was 7 years old, high and clear and innocent, with that peculiar lisp I'd had before the speech therapy. The slight breathlessness that came from excitement over everything. The way I used to stretch out the vowels when I was trying to sound important. I looked around the car, expecting to see other passengers reacting to something so obviously wrong, so fundamentally impossible. But commuters continued staring at their phones, reading their newspapers, dozing against the windows, as if nothing had happened. The train slowed as it approached the station, brakes hissing in their familiar pattern. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited, listening intently for the next announcement. Roosevelt Avenue. Transfer available to the F&M trains. Stand clear of the closing doors. The automated system again. Normal, expected, adult and electronic and perfectly unremarkable. I must have imagined it. The early morning, the repetitive motion of the train, the way sound could play tricks in the enclosed space of the subway car. Any of these could explain why I thought I'd heard something impossible. But as the doors hissed open and passengers shuffled past me onto the platform, I caught myself listening more carefully than usual to the ambient sounds of the train. The rumble of wheels on tracks, the whisper of hydraulic systems, the distant echo of announcements from other cars. Somewhere in that mechanical symphony, I was waiting to hear something that shouldn't exist. The doors closed with their pneumatic sigh, and we lurched forward into the tunnel. Fluorescent lights flickered past the windows, creating a strobing pattern that made the advertisements above the seats seem to pulse with their own rhythm. I found myself studying them. Cell phone plans and insurance companies, Broadway shows and adult education programs. Normal urban background noise made visible. Next stop, Jackson Heights. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice that emerged from the speakers was mine at age 6, maybe 7. With that particular earnestness children brought to everything they considered important. I could hear the concentrated effort. I used to put into pronouncing difficult words correctly. The way my tongue would press carefully against my teeth to avoid the lisp. But underneath the familiar cadence of my childhood voice, there was something else. A quality I didn't remember, a sadness, perhaps, or a kind of knowing that seemed far too mature for such a young speaker. I looked around the car again, more frantically this time. Surely someone else had noticed. The businessman reading his tablet. The woman knitting in the corner. The teenager with earbuds. They all continued their activities with perfect composure. Either they hadn't heard what I'd heard, or they were all engaged in some elaborate pretense of normalcy. Or I was losing my mind. The train began to slow, and I pressed closer to the speakers mounted above the doors, tilting my head to catch every nuance of the next announcement. Jackson Heights. Transfer available to the 7 Express. Please stand clear of the closing doors. Normal again. The standard recording. Gender neutral and efficient. Designed to convey information without personality or character. The voice of the system, not the voice of memory. But I had heard what I had heard. As passengers moved around me, I remained frozen in place, my ears straining for any hint of that impossible sound. A woman brushed past me with a muttered apology, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something floral and too sweet. The kind of scent that might have appealed to a child, but seemed cloying to adult senses. The doors closed, and we pulled away from the station. I found myself thinking about childhood in a way I hadn't for years, not the sanitized nostalgia of family photos and holiday memories, but the actual texture of being young. The way sounds had seemed different then, more vivid and significant. The way I used to practice speaking into mirrors, pretending to be a grown-up, an announcer. Someone important enough that others would listen to what I had to say. Had I ever imagined being the voice on a subway train? I couldn't remember. But it seemed like the kind of thing that would have appealed to my younger self. The authority of it. The way everyone had to listen, whether they wanted to or not. The power to guide people through the underground maze of the city, approaching 74th Street. My voice again, but older this time, maybe 8 or 9, with some of the breathless excitement replaced by a more measured tone. I could hear the gap where my front tooth had fallen out, the slight whistle that had accompanied my speech for weeks until the adult tooth grew in. This time, I was ready for it. I closed my eyes and concentrated, trying to catch every detail. Yes, it was definitely my voice. But there were layers to it I didn't remember, harmonics and overtones, that suggested the recording had been made in a specific space. Not a professional studio with its dead acoustics, but somewhere with natural reverb. A large room, perhaps, or a bathroom. The memory surfaced with startling clarity. I was 8 years old, standing in the bathroom of our apartment, speaking into my mother's tape recorder. I had been pretending to be a radio announcer, practicing the formal cadence I associated with important voices. I would hold the small device close to my mouth and recite whatever came to mind weather reports. news broadcasts, and yes, transit announcements. I had forgotten about those tapes completely. My mother had recorded hours of my childhood chatter, planning to save them as keepsakes. But after the divorce, after the moves and the chaos that followed, most of our belongings had been lost or discarded. Those recordings should have disappeared decades ago, along with so many other artifacts of my early life. So how was one of them playing through the subway's public address system? The train slowed, and I opened my eyes to watch passengers prepare for the stop. Everything appeared normal, the same tired commuters, the same worn seats, the same advertisements promising better lives through better purchases. But the quality of light seemed different now, softer somehow, as if filtered through something I couldn't identify. 74th Street. Transfer available to the R and the W trains. Stand clear of the closing doors. The standard announcement returned, but I barely heard it. I was too busy trying to reconstruct that long-ago afternoon in the bathroom, trying to remember what else I might have said into that recorder. Had I practiced other announcements? Had I created entire fantasy broadcasts, complete with advertising and commentary? The thought made my skin crawl. If someone had those tapes, if someone was using them now, what else might they contain? What embarrassing childhood confessions? What innocent secrets? What private moments had I unknowingly preserved for some stranger to discover and exploit? As we pulled away from the station, I found myself studying my fellow passengers with new suspicion. The businessman looked up from his tablet and met my eyes for just a moment before looking away. Had there been recognition in that glance? Or was I projecting meaning onto a perfectly innocent interaction? The woman with the knitting needles worked with mechanical precision, her fingers moving in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Click, click, click. The rhythm matched the train's movement over the rails, and I wondered if she was actually knitting, or just going through the motions, performing normalcy, while listening for something else. Even the teenager with the earbuds seemed suspect now. The wires disappeared into his jacket pocket, but was he really listening to music? Or was he monitoring some kind of communication device? His foot tapped against the floor in a pattern that might have been following a beat, or might have been sending signals to someone, somewhere, about my reactions to the impossible announcements. Next stop, Roosevelt Island. This time, the voice was older, maybe 10 or 11 years old, but definitely still mine. I could hear the careful pronunciation I had worked so hard to achieve, the way I had learned to avoid the lisp, by positioning my tongue just so. But there was something else in this version, something that made my chest tighten with recognition and dread. Fear. My childhood voice was afraid of something, and that fear colored every syllable. It was subtle, probably undetectable to anyone who hadn't lived inside that voice, but I could hear it clearly. The slight tremble on certain consonants, the way the pitch rose, just a little too high at the end of phrases, the barely controlled breathing between words. What had I been afraid of when I made that recording? The memory came back in fragments. I was 11, maybe 12. My parents had been fighting more frequently, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our apartment at all hours. I had started spending more time in the bathroom, partly for privacy and partly because the fan provided white noise that masked the sounds of their arguments. I had made those recordings as a kind of escape, creating fantasy worlds where I was in control, where my voice mattered, where I could guide people safely from one place to another. But even in those fantasies, something had been wrong. Even in my make-believe world of subway announcements, I had been afraid. The train began to slow, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The air in the car felt thicker somehow, as if the recycled atmosphere was carrying more than just oxygen and carbon dioxide. There were other things mixed in now, memories, perhaps, or the residue of emotions too old to name. Roosevelt Island. This is Roosevelt Island. The standard announcement, but I barely heard it over the rushing in my ears. Because I remembered now what I had been afraid of all those years ago. Not my parents' divorce, though that had been part of it. Not the instability of our living situation, though that too had contributed to my anxiety. I had been afraid of my own voice. In those bathroom recordings, I had begun to notice something that terrified my younger self sometimes. When I played the tapes back, there were things I didn't remember saying. Additional words, extra sentences, entire conversations that seemed to have been recorded without my knowledge or intention. At first, I had convinced myself that I simply forgot some of what I had said. Children's memories were unreliable, and I had made so many recordings that they had begun to blur together. But as the phenomenon continued, I had started to suspect something more disturbing. The voice on the tapes sounded like me, but it said things I would never say. It knew things I had never learned. It spoke with an authority that felt both familiar and completely alien. I had stopped making the recordings after that, and eventually forgotten about them entirely. But now, decades later, those impossible additions seemed to be broadcasting through the subway system, mixed in with my normal childhood announcements as if they had always belonged together. Approaching Lexington Avenue. This time, the voice was mine at its most afraid, maybe 12 years old, on the verge of adolescence, speaking with the careful control of someone trying not to cry. But underneath that control was something else, something that made my adult self want to cover my ears and run from the train. It was the voice of something pretending to be me. Oh, it sounded like me, every inflection, and hesitation was perfectly replicated. But there was a quality beneath the surface that I recognize now as fundamentally other. It was the voice of something that had learned to mimic my speech patterns, but didn't quite understand the emotions behind them. Fear rendered by an intelligence that knew what fear sounded like but had never experienced it directly. The businessman was staring at me now, his tablet forgotten in his lap. The woman had stopped knitting, her needles suspended in mid-stitch. Even the teenager had pulled out one earbud and was looking in my direction with undisguised curiosity. They could hear it, too. But their expressions weren't puzzled or concerned. They were expectant, as if they had been waiting for this moment, as if my recognition of the impossible voice was exactly what they had hoped to witness. The train began to slow, and I backed toward the doors, suddenly desperate to escape the enclosed space of the car. But as I moved, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, and for just a moment, superimposed over my adult face, I saw myself at 12 years old, mouth open, he eyes wide with the kind of terror, that comes from discovering that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had ever warned you. Lexington Avenue. Transfer available to the 4, 5, and 6 trains. The standard announcement played. But I could see the other passengers' lips moving silently along with the words, as if they had memorized this particular script long ago. As if they had been waiting decades for me to finally hear what they had been listening to all along. The doors opened with their hydraulic hiss, and cool air from the platform rushed in. He carrying with it the familiar sense of the underground, metal and concrete, and the accumulated breath of millions of commuters. I stepped toward the opening, but hesitated at the threshold. Because I could see now that the platform outside wasn't the one I expected. The walls were covered with posters advertising products that had been discontinued decades ago. Television shows from my childhood. Movies I had seen with my parents back when we had still been a family. The few people waiting for the train were dressed in styles that seemed to come from different eras entirely, as if time had become unstuck in this particular station. And from the speakers mounted throughout the platform, I could hear the echo of my own voice, not the mechanical announcements, but the free form chatter I used to record in the bathroom. Childhood observations about the world, questions I had asked when no adults were around to answer them, and underneath it all, that other voice, the one that sounded like me but wasn't me, speaking words I had never said about things I had never seen. The doors began to close, and I had to make a choicey step onto the platform and confront whatever was waiting for me there, or remain on the train and continue toward my original destination, pretending that nothing had changed. But as the doors slid shut and the train pulled away from the station, I realized that the choice had already been made for me long ago. In a bathroom with a tape recorder and a child's voice speaking words that didn't belong to him. The next announcement came from all around me now, not just from the speakers, but from the walls themselves, from the air, from the spaces between heartbeats where possibility lived. Final stop, said my voice at every age I had ever been, speaking in unison with something that had been waiting decades for me to finally hear it clearly. End of the line. All passengers must exit here. And as the train began to slow for the last time, I understood that I had been riding toward this moment my entire life, guided by announcements I had made before I was old enough to understand their meaning, following a route that had been planned by someone who knew exactly where I needed to go. The doors opened, and I stepped out into a station that existed somewhere between memory and dream, where the voice of my childhood would finally tell me all the things it had been trying to say for 30 years. Behind me, the train pulled away empty, its destination signs scrolling through stations that had never existed, carrying no passengers toward places that could only be reached by those who had learned to listen to the voices they thought they had left behind. Story 5. The subway tunnel stretched ahead of me like a mouth, its tiled walls sweating with decades of accumulated moisture, and the breath of 10 million passengers. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m., and quickened my pace. The last train had been delayed, then cancelled entirely due to what the crackling announcement called signal problems, leaving me to walk through the service tunnel that connected the abandoned city hall station to the main line. Technically, I wasn't supposed to be here. The Metropolitan Transit Authority had sealed most of these old passages years ago. Remnants of a subway system that had grown and changed like a living organism, leaving behind obsolete arteries that most people had forgotten existed. But I worked for the Transit Authority's Historical Preservation Department, and I had the keys that opened doors most New Yorkers didn't even know were there. My footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow space, the sound bouncing off curved walls that had been built more than a century ago. The tunnel was lit by a string of bare bulbs that stretched into the distance, each one throwing a pool of sickly yellow light that barely touched the surrounding darkness. Between the lights, shadows gathered thick enough to hide anything that might have wandered down from the active lines above. I'd walked this route dozens of times during my 5 years with the MTA, documenting the old infrastructure before it crumbled beyond repair. But tonight felt different. The air was thicker somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my jacket. Maybe it was the storm that had been threatening all evening, finally building to something significant up on the surface. Halfway through the tunnel, I heard the first crackle of static. It came from one of the old speaker boxes mounted high on the wall, a relic from the days when these passages had carried active subway traffic. The speaker grills were green with corrosion, their metal faces pitted by decades of moisture and neglect. They hadn't broadcast anything in at least 20 years, according to the maintenance records I'd reviewed. But as I passed beneath the nearest speaker, static hissed softly from its corroded surface, punctuated by what might have been fragments of voice, syllables that sounded almost like words, but decayed beyond recognition. I stopped walking and pulled out my flashlight, aiming its beam up at the speaker. The metal housing was more deteriorated than I'd remembered, eaten away by rust, until it looked like a skull's empty eye socket. But the static continued, soft and persistent, with an underlying rhythm that reminded me of breathing. Hello. I called out, feeling foolish, but unable to resist the impulse. My voice echoed back to me from both directions, multiplied and distorted until it sounded like a chorus of strangers calling from the darkness. The static paused, as if the speaker system were listening, processing my voice. Then it resumed with what I could have sworn was a more deliberate pattern. Short bursts followed by longer ones, like Morse code or some other kind of signal. I began walking again, faster now, but the static followed me. Each speaker I passed crackled to life as I approached, maintaining a constant susurrus of electronic noise that seemed to pace my footsteps. When I slowed down, the static grew quieter. When I sped up, it grew more intense. This had to be some kind of automated system, I told myself. Maybe the storm outside was causing electrical interference, activating dormant circuits in the old public address network. There were probably motion sensors or proximity detectors that I hadn't noticed before, designed to trigger announcements when maintenance workers passed through. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, the static began to resolve into something more coherent. Words, spoken in a voice that was maddeningly familiar, but impossible to place. Subject is walking through the tunnel at approximately 12 miles per hour. I froze my flashlight beam wavering against the damp tile walls. The voice was clear now, tinged with the metallic quality of old broadcast equipment, but unmistakably articulate. And it was describing me, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a standard issue MTA flashlight. Subject appears to be alone. My heart began to beat faster. That familiar flutter of panic I'd been managing since my anxiety disorder had surfaced during college. But this wasn't an abstract fear. This was something concrete, immediate, and completely inexplicable. The voice continued its commentary as I stood frozen in the circle of my flashlight's glow. Subject has stopped moving and appears to be listening to this broadcast. Pulse rate estimated at 110 beats per minute and rising. How could it know my heart rate? I looked around frantically, searching for cameras or sensors that might be monitoring me. But the tunnel walls showed only the expected infrastructure: pipes, cables, and the occasional maintenance access panel. Nothing that looked like surveillance equipment. I forced myself to start walking again, but slower now, my ears straining to catch every word that emerged from the corroded speakers. Subject is resuming forward motion, but movement pattern suggests heightened alertness. Breathing has become shallow and rapid. The voice was right. I was breathing too fast, hyperventilating in the stale tunnel air. I tried to slow my respiratory rate, counting to 4 on each inhale, as my therapist had taught me. But my body refused to cooperate. Subject is attempting to control panic response through measured breathing. Previous psychological evaluations suggest anxiety disorder with acute stress reactions. That stopped me cold. There was no way, absolutely no way, that whatever was broadcasting through these speakers could know about my medical history. My anxiety diagnosis was in confidential files known only to my doctor, my therapist, and the MTA's occupational health department. Unless this was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe my coworkers had set up a hidden camera system, were monitoring me remotely and improvising this running commentary for their own entertainment. It would explain how they knew so much personal information, how they could track my movements so precisely. But the voice continued, and what it said next made my blood run cold. Subject is hypothesizing that this broadcast represents a practical joke perpetrated by colleagues. This theory will prove inadequate when subject realizes that the voice belongs to subject himself. I listened more carefully to the tone, the cadence, the particular way the voice formed consonants. And with growing horror, I realized it was true. The voice emerging from the speakers was my own voice, but speaking words I had never said, describing observations I was not making. Subject has now recognized voice pattern match. Cortisol and adrenaline levels spiking. Flight response imminent. My own voice, predicting my own reactions with clinical detachment. I began to run. The tunnel seemed longer now, stretching endlessly ahead of me. My footsteps thundered against the concrete, echoing back as a chaotic percussion that made it impossible to judge distances or directions. But over the noise of my flight, I could still hear the speakers crackling to life, one by one, as I passed beneath them. Subject is now running at approximately 15 miles per hour. Estimated time to tunnel exit 4 minutes, 30 seconds at current pace. How could it know how fast I was running? How could it calculate my arrival time? I pushed myself harder, but my legs were already burning from the exertion. 5 years of desk work had not prepared me for sprinting through abandoned subway tunnels. Cardiovascular stress approaching dangerous levels. Subject should reduce pace to avoid cardiac episode. I slowed down despite myself, my body responding to the medical warning, even though my mind rejected its source. The voice, my voice, continued its commentary with the same clinical objectivity. Heart rate now exceeding 160 beats per minute. Perspiration indicates core body temperature elevation. Recommend immediate rest and hydration. A new speaker crackled to life ahead of me, and I realized the broadcast wasn't just following me. It was preceding me, anticipating my route through the tunnel. How was that possible? Subject is questioning broadcast mechanism and wondering how commentary can anticipate subject's location. This confusion indicates incomplete understanding of current situation. I stopped running again, gasping in the humid air. Whatever was happening here went beyond any rational explanation I could construct. Hidden cameras, elaborate pranks, psychological experiments. None of these theories could account for a broadcast system that seemed to read my thoughts and predict my actions. Subject is attempting to construct rational framework for anomalous phenomena. Success probability 0%. Recommend acceptance of situation as presented. What do you want from me? I shouted at the nearest speaker, my voice cracking with strain and fear. The static paused, as if considering my question. When the broadcast resumed, the tone had changed slightly. Less clinical, more conversational. Subject has initiated direct communication. This represents significant progress. Query regarding motivation suggests readiness for expanded dialogue.
Answer the question,
I demanded. Current objective is documentation and analysis of subject's psychological state under stress. Secondary objective is evaluation of subject's capacity for accepting alternative explanations of reality. Documentation. Analysis. This was starting to sound less like a prank and more like some kind of experiment. But who would conduct such an experiment, and why? And how could they have access to technology that seemed to violate basic principles of cause and effect? I began walking again, but slowly now, my mind racing through possibilities. The voice matched my pace, maintaining its running commentary. Subject is processing new information and attempting to identify responsible parties. Consideration of governmental agencies probable. Consideration of corporate research probable. Consideration of non-terrestrial intelligence improbable but increasing. Non-terrestrial intelligence. Now the voice was just messing with me, throwing out increasingly absurd possibilities to gauge my reactions. But even as I dismissed the suggestion, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental about my situation had changed in ways I didn't yet understand. The tunnel was beginning to curve now, following the old subway line's path toward the main station. But the curvature seemed wrong somehow. More pronounced than I remembered from previous walks through this passage. And the spacing between light fixtures had changed, creating longer stretches of shadow between the pools of illumination. Subject has noted alterations in tunnel architecture. These observations are accurate. Physical space has been modified to accommodate extended observation period. Modified. How could the tunnel have been modified? I'd been in here dozens of times, knew every tile and cable and maintenance access point. But looking around me now, I could see that the voice was right. The walls were different. The ceiling height had changed. And there were speakers mounted where I was certain none had existed before. Subject is experiencing cognitive dissonance as perceived reality conflicts with established memories. This discomfort is normal and will subside as adaptation occurs. Adaptation to what? I wanted to ask, but my throat felt constricted, as if the tunnel's thick air was becoming harder to breathe. The temperature seemed to be rising too, though that might have been a result of my exertion and stress. Ambient temperature has increased by 6 degrees Fahrenheit since subject entered modified space. Humidity rising proportionally. Atmospheric changes are intentional and serve multiple research purposes. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, running down my spine beneath my jacket. But it wasn't just the heat. There was something else in the air now. Quality I couldn't identify, but that made my skin crawl with primitive unease. Subject is detecting pheromone markers introduced to atmosphere. These compounds are designed to enhance emotional responsiveness and reduce rational analysis. Effects will intensify over next 10 minutes. Pheromones. They were drugging me through the air. This was beyond any reasonable experiment. This was assault, kidnapping, possibly attempted murder. I needed to get out of this tunnel immediately. But when I tried to run again, my legs felt sluggish, uncoordinated. The chemical compounds in the air, if that's what they were, seemed to be affecting my motor control as well as my emotional state. I stumbled forward, using the wall for support. Subject is experiencing mild neurological impairment due to atmospheric modifications. Motor control will remain functional but reduced. Cognitive function will shift from analytical to experiential processing. The tunnel ahead began to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But there was no heat source visible, nothing that could account for the distortion. As I watched, the walls themselves seemed to ripple, their solid surfaces becoming fluid and dreamlike. Visual distortions indicate successful activation of hallucinogenic compounds. Subject will now begin to experience expanded perceptual range. Reality parameters are being adjusted for optimal data collection. The voice was becoming more distant now, as if the speakers were receding into some vast space much larger than the tunnel I'd entered. And my own perception was shifting, expanding beyond the narrow beam of my flashlight to encompass areas that should have been invisible in the darkness. I could see the tunnel extending infinitely in both directions, its walls breathing like living tissue. The speakers had multiplied, covering every surface with their corroded metal faces, all of them whispering in voices that sounded like mine, but spoke languages I didn't recognize. And standing in the distance, barely visible in the shifting light, I could see a figure watching me. It was too far away to make out clearly, but something about its posture and proportions suggested that it was human, or had once been human. Subject has made visual contact with observer. This represents the final phase of documentation process. Observer will now approach for direct evaluation. The figure began walking toward me, its movements smooth and deliberate. As it drew closer, I could see that it was wearing the same clothes I was wearing, carrying the same model of flashlight, even had the same nervous gestures I'd developed over years of working in enclosed spaces. But its face was wrong. The features were mine, but rearranged somehow. Assembled by someone who understood the individual components, but not how they fit together. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too narrow. The proportions subtly skewed in ways that triggered some deep evolutionary alarm. Observer has reached optimal distance for final evaluation. Subject's psychological profile is now complete. Data collection concluding in 30 seconds. The other me stopped, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, standing in that strange shimmer that seemed to surround everything now. When it spoke, its voice emerged not just from its mouth, but from all the speakers simultaneously, creating an impossible chorus of identical tones. Do you understand now what you really are? I tried to answer, tried to ask what it meant, but my voice wouldn't work. The chemicals in the air had progressed beyond affecting my motor control. Now they were shutting down my ability to communicate, to resist, to do anything but observe. You're not the person walking through this tunnel, the other me continued. You're the person being observed. You're the voice in the speakers, describing someone else's journey through a place that doesn't exist. The tunnel began to dissolve around me, its solid walls becoming transparent, revealing the vast space that lay beyond. I could see monitors and recording equipment. Banks of computers processing streams of data, technicians in white coats taking notes on clipboards. And in the center of it all, a figure walking through a simple concrete tunnel, talking to empty speakers, reacting to voices that existed only in their own mind. Final data point recorded. Subject has achieved full recognition of experimental parameters. Simulation ending in 10, 9, 8. I tried to scream, tried to run, tried to do anything to break free from whatever was happening to me. But I wasn't the one in the tunnel anymore. I was the one watching, the one speaking into the microphones, the one analyzing and documenting and describing. 3, 2, 1. The last thing I heard as the simulation collapsed was my own voice, speaking with clinical detachment into a recording device. Subject exhibited typical stress responses when confronted with recursive observation scenario. Recommend adjusting parameters for next iteration to increase psychological pressure. End of session log. And then I was back in the tunnel, walking alone, listening to the sound of my own footsteps echoing off tiled walls. But now I knew I wasn't the one walking. I was the one in the speakers, forever describing someone else's journey through a place that might or might not exist, watching myself react to my own voice with growing horror and recognition. The broadcast had been right about one thing. Adaptation was necessary. After all, I had eternity to get used to it. Story 6. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just the wind through the steel cables. You know how bridges sound at night, that low. Metallic humming that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. I'd been crossing the Meridian Bridge every evening for 3 months, walking home from my late shift at the data center. The same route, the same time, the same steady rhythm of my footsteps on the pedestrian walkway. 11:40, 7 p.m. always. My phone would buzz with a text from Sarah asking if I'd made it across safely. A sweet gesture. Though I never understood why she worried about that particular stretch. The bridge was well lit, well maintained, with a constant stream of late night traffic humming past in the adjacent lanes. But on that Tuesday in October, something changed. I was halfway across when I heard it, a sound that wasn't quite the wind, wasn't quite the traffic, wasn't quite anything I could identify. It was soft, almost inaudible beneath the ambient noise, but unmistakably there. A whisper. No, not a whisper exactly. More like a suggestion, a gentle brushing of sound against the edge of consciousness. Don't turn around. I stopped walking. My hand tightened on the bridge's railing, the cold metal biting through my gloves. The words had been so clear, so deliberate, that I found myself scanning the walkway ahead of me for their source. But there was no one. Just the empty concrete stretching toward the far shore, bathed in the sodium glare of the streetlights. Don't turn around, the voice said again, and this time I was certain it was coming from behind me. My neck muscles tensed involuntarily. Every instinct screamed at me to look back, to identify the speaker, to make sense of what I was hearing. But something deeper, some primal understanding, kept me frozen in place. The voice wasn't threatening, exactly. If anything, it sounded protective, concerned. I forced myself to keep walking, each step measured and deliberate. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud now, echoing off the bridge's superstructure with a hollow, metallic ring. The familiar weight of my backpack felt heavier, the straps cutting into my shoulders. Even my breathing sounded amplified in the night air. Good, the voice murmured, and I could swear I felt warm breath against the back of my neck. Keep walking. Don't look back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Sarah's usual check. But I didn't dare reach for it. My hands were shaking now, though whether from cold or something else, I couldn't say. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress hallucinations from too many late shifts, acoustic tricks played by the bridge's architecture, maybe even a practical joke by someone with a hidden speaker. But I kept walking forward, and I didn't turn around. The next night, I took a different route home. 20 minutes longer, through poorly lit side streets, and past the abandoned shopping center. But anything seemed preferable to crossing that bridge again. Sarah noticed the delay in my arrival and asked about it over dinner. Construction. I lied, not understanding why I lied. They've got one lane closed for repairs. She nodded, spooning pasta onto my plate. That's annoying. How long do you think it'll take? Not sure. Could be a while. But the alternate route wore on me. By Friday, the extra 40 minutes of walking each day had left me exhausted and irritable. The detour took me past the old industrial district, where broken streetlights cast everything in harsh, intermittent shadows. Twice I'd encountered groups of teenagers who watched me pass with predatory interest. Once, a man had followed me for 3 blocks before disappearing into an alley. The bridge, by comparison, had always felt safe. Exposed, yes, but safe in its exposure. Monitored by traffic cameras, visible to dozens of passing motorists, patrolled regularly by city police. On Monday, I returned to my original route. I approached the bridge with deliberate casualness, checking my phone, adjusting my backpack, humming a half-remembered tune. Just a normal evening walk. Nothing to be concerned about, nothing to anticipate. But as soon as my foot touched the bridge's walkway, I felt it a subtle shift in the air, like the atmospheric pressure change before a storm. The hair on my arms stood up beneath my jacket. My tongue tasted metallic, electric. "You came back," the voice said, and this time it sounded pleased. I kept walking, eyes fixed on the path ahead. My reflection moved alongside me in the dark windows of passing cars, a solitary figure moving through pools of yellow light. But in my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of other shapes, shadows that didn't quite align with the streetlight's angles, movement that wasn't quite synchronized with my own pace. "Don't turn around," the voice reminded me, gentler now, almost fond. "You're learning." "Learning what?" I whispered, surprising myself by speaking aloud. "To trust." The word hung in the air between us, trust. Such a simple concept, but loaded with implications I didn't want to examine. Trust in what? In whom? In the voice itself, or in my own ability to follow its guidance? "They're behind you," the voice continued, conversational now. "They've been behind you for weeks, actually, but they can't reach you if you don't acknowledge them. Don't turn around and you'll be safe." My legs almost buckled. "They. Just keep walking. You're doing beautifully." I could hear them now, footsteps that weren't quite footsteps, whispers that weren't quite whispers. A rustling sound like paper being shuffled or leaves being crushed underfoot. But there were no leaves on the bridge, and no paper except the occasional cigarette wrapper blown against the railing by the wind. "Almost there," the voice encouraged. "Just a few more steps." The end of the bridge seemed impossibly far away. Each streetlight passed with agonizing slowness, and the space between them stretched like years. My backpack felt heavier with every step, as if something was being added to it, item by item. The straps cut deeper into my shoulders. My legs ached, but I didn't turn around. When I finally reached solid ground on the far side, the sounds behind me stopped abruptly. The weight in my backpack disappeared. The electric taste left my mouth, replaced by the familiar flavors of night air and car exhaust. "Well done," the voice said, already fainter. "See you tomorrow." This became our routine. Each night I would cross the bridge, and each night the voice would guide me safely across. We developed a rhythm, the voice and I. Sometimes it would warn me about specific dangers. "Slow down here. There's broken glass ahead, or move to the left, away from the railing." Other times it would simply offer companionship, commenting on the weather or the pattern of traffic below. I began to look forward to these conversations. The voice had a warm, familiar quality, like an old friend whose face you can't quite remember, but whose presence brings comfort. It knew things about me, personal details I'd never shared with anyone. It knew about my recurring dream of falling, about the scar on my knee from a childhood bicycle accident, about the way I counted streetlights when I was nervous. "You're counting again," it would say, amused. 7, 8, 9. You always stop at 12. And it was right. I did always stop at 12. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a bitter wind that turned the bridge into a wind tunnel. I bought a heavier coat, thicker gloves, a wool scarf that I wrapped around my face until only my eyes were exposed. But even through the layers, I could feel the cold seeping into my bones during those long walks across the bridge. The voice seemed closer during these winter months, as if the cold weather had compressed the distance between us. "Are you warm enough?" it would ask. "I worry about you out here in this weather." "I'm fine." I would murmur, my words muffled by the scarf. Just cold. I could make you warmer if you'd let me. I never asked what that meant. Some questions I was learning were better left unasked. It was during one of these winter crossings that I finally understood what was following me. Not what exactly, but how many. The voice had been unusually quiet that night, offering only the standard warning not to turn around. But as I reached the midpoint of the bridge, I could hear them clearly, dozens of footsteps, maybe hundreds, all moving in perfect synchronization with my own. They're growing stronger, the voice said, and for the first time, it sounded worried. More of them every night. They're drawn to you, to your warmth, to your aliveness. What do they want? What they've always wanted. What they can never have again. I felt them pressing closer, a wall of presence at my back. The air grew thick, suffocating. My vision blurred at the edges, but still I didn't turn around. Keep walking, the voice urged, more insistent now. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't give them an opening. An opening for what? To show you what you'll become. That phrase haunted me for weeks. What you'll become. As if my fate was predetermined. As if this nightly ritual was not protection but preparation. I began to notice changes in myself, subtle at first, then more pronounced. My reflection in mirrors seemed slightly off, as if the person looking back was familiar, but not quite me. I felt lighter, less substantial, as if I was slowly losing density. Sarah noticed too. You look tired, she said one morning over breakfast. Pale. Are you eating enough? I looked down at my untouched eggs, my cooling coffee. When had I last felt hungry? When had I last felt anything, really? I'm fine, I said automatically. Just working too hard. But I wasn't fine. I was changing, becoming something else. Something that belonged more to the bridge than to the world on either side of it. You're beginning to understand, the voice said that night as I approached the familiar entrance to the bridge. Good. Understanding makes the transition easier. Transition to what? To us. To here. To forever. I stopped walking, for the first time in months. I simply stopped in the middle of the bridge and stood perfectly still. The wind whipped around me, carrying with it the scent of something I couldn't identify, something old and cold and final. Don't stop, the voice said sharply. You know better than that. I want to see them. No, you don't. I want to see what's behind me. That way lies madness, and worse. But I was already beginning to turn. Slowly, deliberately, my neck muscles screaming in protest after months of enforced stillness. The voice was shouting now, pleading, but its words seemed to come from very far away.
Don't look back! Don't turn around! You'll lose everything!
I've already lost everything, I whispered, and I turned. What I saw was myself. Dozens of myself, hundreds of myself. A stretching back across the bridge in an endless line. All of us walking forward, all of us wearing the same clothes, carrying the same backpack, taking the same measured steps. Some versions were transparent, barely visible, while others seemed solid and real. But all of them, all of us, were walking toward the same destination. At the very back of the line, I could see the newest addition, a figure that looked confused, frightened, constantly glancing over its shoulder, as if hearing whispers in the wind. Now you know, the voice said sadly. It was coming from the figure directly in front of me, the one I'd been following all these months. Its mouth didn't move when it spoke, but I could see my own lips forming the words. Now you understand what you've become. I looked ahead, toward the end of the bridge, and saw myself there, too, standing at the railing, looking back at the approaching line with eyes full of recognition and resignation. That version of me raised a hand in greeting, or perhaps farewell. Your turn, it said, and stepped backward into the void. I walked forward to take its place at the railing. Behind me, I could hear new footsteps approaching someone else who would need guidance, protection, warning. Someone else who would need to be told, again and again, not to turn around. The first time they heard me, they thought it was just the wind. Don't turn around, I whispered into the darkness. Keep walking. You're almost safe. And somewhere behind me, in the endless line of ourselves, a new voice joined the chorus, confused, frightened, but learning to trust. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Story 7. The old Victorian house came with its quirks, the realtor had said. Creaking floorboards that sang their wooden songs in the night. Windows that rattled like chattering teeth. The wind picked up. Pipes that gurgled and whispered secrets through the walls. These were the sounds of character, she assured me. The gentle breathing of a home that had lived through decades of stories. But she never mentioned the laughter. It started 3 nights after I moved in, just as I was settling into that delicious drowsiness that comes before sleep. A soft giggling drifted down from somewhere above my bedroom ceiling, light and musical, like silver bells scattered across marble. A children's laughter, innocent and pure, the kind that bubbles up from deep joy and spreads like ripples in still water. I opened my eyes in the darkness, listening. The sound seemed to dance across the ceiling, moving from one corner to another, then fading to silence. Old houses, I told myself. Old houses carry echoes of the families who lived here before. Sound travels in mysterious ways through aged wood and settled foundations. The second night, the laughter came earlier, just as I was brushing my teeth. This time I could hear it more clearly, 2 voices, maybe 3, taking turns in their melodic conversation of giggles and whispers. I paused, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, foam dripping slowly into the sink. The sound seemed to be directly overhead, in the space between my bathroom ceiling and whatever lay above. I had explored the house thoroughly before buying it. 2 stories, an unfinished basement, and according to the blueprints, no attic access. The roof sloped steeply, leaving only a narrow triangular space that the previous owners had deemed too small and awkward to utilize. Yet the laughter seemed to originate from exactly that impossible space. On the 3rd night, I stood on a chair in my bedroom closet, pressing my ear against the ceiling. The plaster felt cool against my skin, and I could hear the subtle creaking of the house settling, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hum of the refrigerator 2 floors below. So close it seemed to be mere inches from my face, came the soft patter of footsteps, small feet bare against wood, running, chasing, playing some eternal game of tag across the narrow space above my head. The footsteps were followed by breathless giggles, hushed whispers, and what sounded like small hands patting against the floorboards in rhythm, a children's clapping game, perhaps, passed down through generations of invisible playmates. I bought a stepladder the next day. That evening, I positioned it carefully beneath the spot where the sounds seemed strongest, and climbed until my hands could touch the ceiling. I ran my fingers across the smooth plaster, searching for any sign of an access panel, a hidden door, some explanation for the mystery above. The plaster was seamless, painted over so many times that any seams or joints had long since disappeared beneath layers of white and cream and pale yellow. But as I traced patterns across the surface with my fingertips, I could swear I felt vibrations, tiny tremors, that seemed to pulse in time with a heartbeat, or perhaps with the rhythm of small feet dancing just beyond my reach. That night, the laughter began before I even went to bed. I was reading in the living room when the first giggles drifted down, and I found myself tilting my head to listen, but the sounds were clearer now, more distinct. I could hear individual voices, one higher and more melodic, another deeper with a slight lisp, a third that seemed to catch with emotion, as if the child were laughing through tears of pure joy. They seemed to be having a conversation, though I couldn't make out the words. The cadence was unmistakable, questions and answers, exclamations and responses, the natural flow of friends sharing secrets and stories. Sometimes one voice would pause, and I could hear the others listening intently, waiting their turn to speak. Then the talking would dissolve into laughter again, sweet and innocent and impossibly present. I began to look forward to the sounds. My evening routine adapted itself around them. I would finish dinner, tidy the kitchen, and then settle into my favorite armchair with a book, waiting for the evening performance to begin. The children, for that's how I had begun to think of them, seemed to sense my attention. The laughter grew more animated, more theatrical, as if they were putting on a show especially for me. But children's voices in an impossible attic raised questions that my rational mind couldn't answer. On Saturday morning, I called the previous owners. Mrs. Henderson was 83 and had lived in the house for 40, 7 years before moving to a retirement community. Her voice was thin and careful over the phone, like paper being folded repeatedly. "Children," she repeated when I asked. "Oh, yes." There were always children in that house. My own 3 when they were young, then their children when they came to visit. The house loves children, you know. It holds onto their laughter. I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to drift into memory. "Mrs. Henderson," I prompted gently, "did you ever hear sounds from the attic area?" A long pause. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. Some houses remember better than others. Some houses don't let go. She hung up before I could ask what she meant. That evening, I positioned myself directly beneath the strongest point of activity with a digital recorder. The device sat on my nightstand, red light blinking steadily as it captured the ambient sounds of the old house, the settling beams, the whisper of air through the heating vents, the distant hum of electricity flowing through aged wires. The laughter began at 11:17 p.m., according to the timestamp. This time I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, letting the sounds wash over me. I could hear them so clearly now, 3 distinct voices, each with its own personality and timbre. The first was bold and confident, often initiating the games and conversations. The second was gentler, more thoughtful, sometimes shushing the others when their games grew too boisterous. The third was the youngest, I thought, with a tendency to dissolve into helpless giggles at the slightest provocation. They seemed to be playing hide and seek, counting slowly to 10 in song voices, then scurrying across the narrow space with muffled footsteps and suppressed laughter. I found myself holding my breath during the counting, releasing it slowly during the seeking, as if I too were part of their eternal game. When I played back the recording the next morning, I heard only the house's familiar symphony, creaking, settling, breathing in its ancient rhythm. The digital file contained no trace of the laughter that had filled my evening with such vivid presence. I rewound and played it again, adjusting the volume, enhancing the high frequencies, filtering out the bass tones. Nothing. Only the quiet conversation between old wood and older nails, the whispered secrets of a house that had stood through decades of weather and time. But I had heard them. I was certain of it. Their voices were as real as my own heartbeat, as present as the air moving in and out of my lungs. The absence of evidence didn't negate the truth of experience. It only made that truth more precious, more fragile, more mine. The children began to visit me in dreams. Not nightmares, but gentle visitations where I found myself in that narrow attic space, crouched beneath the sloping roof, with 3 small figures whose faces remained always just beyond the edge of vision. We played their games hide and seek among the support beams, word games where we took turns creating stories that dissolved into laughter, quiet games where we simply sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the house breathing around us. In my dreams, I understood that they had been waiting a long time for someone who could hear them properly, someone who would listen without fear or skepticism, someone who would become part of their eternal play rather than trying to explain it away. The previous family had heard them too, but children grow up and move away, and adults forget how to listen with their hearts instead of their minds. I began leaving small gifts in the closet where I kept my stepladder, a wooden top that spun with a satisfying hum, a kaleidoscope filled with colored glass that cast rainbow patterns on the walls, a music box that played Brahms' Lullaby in delicate, crystalline notes. The gifts remained untouched, but somehow they seemed less substantial each morning, as if their essence had been absorbed by grateful hands I couldn't see. The laughter evolved, became more complex. I could distinguish between different types of play: the quick, excited giggles of tag and chase, the slower, a more thoughtful laughter that accompanied storytelling, the quiet, contented sounds they made when they were simply enjoying each other's company. Sometimes I heard them singing, wordless melodies that rose and fell like wind through leaves, harmonizing in ways that made my chest tight with inexplicable emotion. 3 weeks after the sounds began, I woke in the middle of the night to find them directly above my bed. Not just the usual sounds, but a presence so strong I could feel the warmth of their attention, pressing down through the plaster ceiling. They were whispering to each other, and though I couldn't make out the words, I understood somehow that they were talking about me. The whispers grew more urgent, more excited. Then came a sound I hadn't heard before, a soft tapping against the ceiling, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. They were trying to communicate, to bridge the gap between their world and mine with the only tool available to them. I reached up and tapped back 3 soft knocks against my headboard. the response was immediate and joyful. Laughter bubbling up like water from a spring. Then more tapping, faster now. More complex patterns that I tried to mirror with my knuckles against the wood. We played this game for an hour, taking turns creating rhythmic patterns, building conversations out of sound and silence. When we finally stopped, exhausted and exhilarated, the house felt different around me, warmer, more alive, more like home than it ever had before. Now, months later, the nightly laughter has become as natural as my own breathing. I've stopped questioning its source, stopped searching for rational explanations. Some experiences exist beyond the reach of logic, in the spaces between what we know and what we feel, in the echo chambers of the heart, where impossible things take root and flourish. The children and I have developed our own language of taps and giggles, of shared silence and mutual attention. They've become my evening companions, my reminder that wonder still exists in the world for those willing to listen with more than their ears. Sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear them settling down for the night too, their laughter growing softer, their whispers more gentle, their games winding down into quiet contentment. In those moments, the boundaries between waking and sleeping, between real and imagined, between possible and impossible, blur into something beautiful and strange. The house remembers, Mrs. Henderson had said. Some houses don't let go. But maybe that's not about holding on to the past. Maybe it's about keeping the door open for joy, preserving space for play, maintaining faith that laughter can transcend the limitations of walls and time, and the narrow definitions of what we call real. Tonight, as every night, I'll listen for my friends in the impossible attic, and they'll be there, playing their eternal games, sharing their wordless songs, reminding me that home is not just a place, but a presence. The warm sound of laughter, drifting down through darkness, the gentle certainty that we are never truly alone. The laughter continues soft and endless, a lullaby made of joy that carries me toward sleep with the promise that tomorrow evening they'll be waiting for me again, ready to play in the space between reality and dreams, where children's voices echo forever through the architecture of memory and hope. Story 8. The soft click of the shutter has always been my comfort. There's something soothing about capturing moments, freezing time in that perfect rectangle of light and shadow. Tonight, like every night for the past month, I sit in my dimly lit apartment, scrolling through the day's photographs on my laptop screen. The blue glow illuminates my face as rain patters against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to my evening ritual. I've been a photographer for 7 years now, mostly portraits and events. People trust me with their memories, their celebrations, their most precious moments. The weight of that responsibility has never bothered me before. If anything, it's given my life purpose, structure. But lately, something has been different. It started 3 weeks ago at the Morrison wedding. A beautiful outdoor ceremony in an old garden, where ivy crawled up weathered stone walls and fairy lights twinkled like fallen stars. I remember the way the late afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees, creating these perfect pockets of golden light. Everything was going perfectly. The bride's laughter as clear as silver bells, the groom's eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. I raised my camera for what should have been the perfect shot, the couple's first kiss as husband and wife. The guests were all turned toward them, faces glowing with happiness and champagne, warmed cheeks. I focused, held my breath, and pressed the shutter. The flash fired. Time stopped. And in that brief, brilliant burst of light, I saw them, standing behind the wedding party, scattered throughout the crowd like shadows that had learned to wear human shapes, were faces I didn't recognize. Pale faces with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. They weren't moving, weren't smiling, weren't even breathing as far as I could tell. They just stood there, watching. The moment passed so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. The flash faded, the wedding continued. And when I looked up from my camera, everything appeared normal. The guests were clapping. The couple was beaming. And the soft evening breeze carried the scent of roses and distant barbecue smoke. But when I got home that night and uploaded the photos, there they were, clear as day. Strangers standing among the invited guests, their faces sharp and emotionless, their clothes oddly dated, as if they'd stepped out of photographs from decades past. In some shots, they stood behind children, and their pale hands hovering just above small shoulders. In others, they lingered at the edges of group photos, their dark eyes fixed directly on my camera lens. I counted them. 17 strangers. 17 people who shouldn't exist. I deleted those photos immediately. Told myself it was a technical glitch, maybe some sort of double exposure or digital artifact. These things happen with older equipment, though mine was barely 2 years old. I even researched it online, spent hours reading photography forums about strange phenomena, unexplained figures appearing in shots. Most of the responses were dismissive. Tricks of light, pareidolia, overactive imaginations. But then it happened again. The Chen family portrait session. A simple indoor shoot with soft lighting and a neutral backdrop. 3 generations gathering to celebrate the grandmother's 80th birthday. I remember the way the youngest child kept giggling, how the grandmother's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her best dress, how the family's love for each other seemed to fill the entire room with warmth. The flash fired for each shot, and each time, I caught glimpses of them in my peripheral vision. The same pale faces, the same hollow eyes, the same outdated clothes. But this time, they weren't just standing in the background. They were closer, sitting in empty chairs that hadn't been there moments before, kneeling beside the children. One was even standing directly behind the grandmother, its colorless lips almost touching her silver hair. When I reviewed those photos later, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the mouse. The strangers were there again, but now they seemed more present, more solid. In one image, I could see the shadow one of them cast across the floor. In another, the fabric of a child's dress was slightly wrinkled where something unseen had brushed against it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress. I'd been working long hours, surviving on coffee and deadline pressure. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, or there was something wrong with my camera's sensor. I even took it to a repair shop, but they found nothing wrong. The technician tested it thoroughly, took dozens of sample shots under various lighting conditions. No anomalies, no mysterious figures, just clean, clear photographs. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made everything worse, because the strangers started appearing in other places too. not just in my work photos, but in casual snapshots. Pictures of my coffee cup in the morning, and there would be a pale hand reaching toward it from outside the frame. Photos of my bookshelf, and shadowy figures would be reflected in the glass covering of framed prints I didn't remember having. I stopped using the flash altogether, started relying solely on natural light and high ISO settings. For a few days, it seemed to work. The strangers vanished from my photographs. I began to sleep better, to convince myself that whatever had been happening was over. Then I took a selfie, just a quick shot in my bathroom mirror before heading out to meet a friend for dinner. No flash. The overhead light was bright enough. I looked at the photo immediately, the way you do with selfies, checking if your smile looks genuine, if your hair is sitting right. Behind my reflection, filling the background of my bathroom, stood dozens of them. Pale figures in outdated clothes, pressed together like sardines, their dark eyes all focused on the camera. On me, some were partially obscured by others, creating this horrible layered effect, as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their faces were clearer than ever before. Sharp cheekbones, colorless lips, and those terrible, hollow eyes that seemed to contain centuries of patient waiting. The phone slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered on the tile floor. When I picked it up, the photo was gone. Not deleted, just gone, as if it had never existed. That was 5 days ago. Since then, I've been testing the theory. Taking photographs obsessively, documenting everything. My morning coffee, the view from my window, the books scattered across my desk, always without flash, always in good light. And always they're there, growing bolder, moving closer. In yesterday's photos, one of them was touching my shoulder. Today, I found a picture where another had its hand pressed against my chest, right over my heart. The stranger's clothes are becoming more modern too, as if they're adapting, learning to blend in. Some now wear contemporary jeans and sweaters, though their faces remain the same. Pale, hollow-eyed, impossibly patient. I've started to recognize individual faces among them. There's a woman with short, dark hair who appears in almost every shot, always standing slightly behind the others. A tall man in what used to be a vintage suit, but is now a modern business jacket. A child, though calling it a child feels wrong somehow, who never seems to age despite appearing in photographs spanning weeks. Tonight, I've been scrolling through every photo I've taken in the past month, studying them with the dedication of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. The progression is clear, undeniable. They're not just appearing in my photographs, they're moving through them, getting closer, becoming more solid, more real with each flash of light. But here's the thing that keeps me awake, staring at my ceiling as the rain continues its steady percussion against my windows. I'm starting to remember them. Not from the photographs, but from before. Fragments of memory that feel like dreams, but too vivid, too detailed to be anything but real. The woman with short, dark hair. I remember her standing in my childhood bedroom doorway, just watching as I pretended to sleep. The tall man was at my high school graduation, standing at the back of the auditorium while my parents cheered in the front row. The child thing has been with me longest of all, playing quietly in corners while the adults talked, always just outside direct vision. They've always been there, haven't they? waiting at the periphery of my life, existing in those spaces between noticed and unnoticed, between memory and forgetting. The camera didn't create them. It just gave them a way to be seen. I understand now why they look the way they do, why their clothes shift and change. Their reflections, echoes of everyone who was never quite there. Everyone who should have been in the photograph, but wasn't. The plus ones who canceled at the last minute. The relatives who died before the family reunion. The children who were never born. The friends who moved away and gradually faded from importance. They're the negative space of human connection, given form and presence through the strange alchemy of light and time and silver halide crystals. Every photograph creates shadows, and some of those shadows learn to remember what it felt like to be human. The rain has stopped. My laptop screen has dimmed to conserve battery, but I can still make out the faint reflection of my own face in the dark monitor. Behind me, the room stretches away into comfortable shadows, familiar furniture creating gentle silhouettes in the darkness. I should go to bed. It's late, and tomorrow I have another wedding to photograph. The Hendersons, they seem like a lovely couple, young, optimistic, planning for a future filled with anniversaries and children and Christmas mornings. They trust me to capture their perfect day, to freeze their happiness in light and time and memory. I wonder how many strangers will be standing among their guests. I wonder if the Hendersons will notice the extra shadows in their wedding photos, or if they'll be like everyone else, seeing only what they expect to see. Their minds unconsciously editing out anything that doesn't fit the narrative of joy and celebration. Maybe that's a kindness. Maybe some truths are too heavy for happiness to bear. But as I close my laptop and prepare for sleep, I catch a glimpse of something in its darkened screen. Just for a moment, between one breath and the next, I see them all reflected there behind me. Dozens of pale faces with hollow eyes, standing patiently in my apartment, waiting for tomorrow's photographs. Waiting to become a little more real, a little more present with each flash of light. The woman with short, dark hair steps closer to my chair. Her hand hovers just above my shoulder. Not quite touching, but close enough that I can feel the coolness of her presence through my shirt. She's been waiting longest of all, I think. Waiting to be seen, to be acknowledged, to finally step fully into the light. Tomorrow, I'll bring my camera to the Henderson wedding. I'll position myself carefully, frame each shot with professional precision, and when the moment comes, when the bride and groom lean in for their first kiss as husband and wife, I'll raise my camera, hold my breath, and press the shutter. The flash will fire, time will stop, and maybe, just maybe, when the light fades and the guests resume their applause, there will be one less stranger standing in the shadows. But probably not. They're patient after all. They've been waiting so very long. A little longer won't matter. Story 9. I first noticed it while brushing my teeth on an ordinary Thursday morning. The kind of morning where sunlight streams through bathroom windows at precisely the angle to make ordinary moments feel touched by grace. The bathroom mirror, framed in brushed silver and mounted above the marble, topped vanity, had been my silent companion for 3 years of morning routines reliable, immediate, faithful in its reproduction of reality. But that morning, something was wrong with time itself. I raised my toothbrush to my mouth, a motion I had performed thousands of times, automatic as breathing. In the mirror, my reflection began the same movement a heartbeat later, as if receiving some delayed signal from across an impossible distance. The lag was subtle, perhaps half a second, maybe less, but unmistakable once noticed, like hearing your own voice on a poor phone connection, familiar words arriving just behind their intended moment. I paused, toothbrush hovering near my lips, and watched my reflection complete the motion I had already stopped. The mirrored version of myself continued brushing for that extra half second, then froze in confusion, matching my stillness with the same temporal delay that now seemed to separate us. I told myself it was fatigue, stress from the project deadline at work, the mind playing tricks when overwhelmed by too many late nights and too much coffee. Mirrors don't delay. They reflect instantly, simultaneously, bound by the speed of light to show us ourselves as we are when we are. This is physics, not psychology. Light travels at a constant speed. Reflection is immediate. Reality follows predictable rules. But when I moved my hand to touch my cheek, my reflection's hand began its journey toward its cheek a full half second later, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach like winter water. Over the following days, I found myself testing the phenomenon obsessively, standing before the bathroom mirror with the focused attention of a scientist conducting experiments on the nature of existence itself. I would move suddenly, jerking my head to the left, raising my arms, stepping to one side, and always, my reflection followed behind like an echo, catching up to reality in its own time. The delay remained consistent half a second, no more, no less. Long enough to be clearly perceptible, short enough to feel like a glitch in the matrix, a small tear in the fabric that holds the world together. I timed it with the stopwatch on my phone, marking the precise interval between action and mirrored response, as if documenting this impossibility might somehow make it comprehensible. Other mirrors in my apartment showed no such delay. The hallway mirror reflected me normally, immediately, as mirrors should. The surface of my coffee cup, the black screen of my television, the windows at night, all showed instantaneous reflections that moved precisely with my movements, confirming that reality was intact everywhere, except for that single bathroom mirror that had begun to live in its own timeline. I researched everything I could find about mirror delays, about time perception, about neurological conditions that might cause such experiences. Most explanations dealt with reaction time, the delay between seeing and responding, between decision and action. But this was different. This was the mirror itself that seemed to exist half a second in the past, showing me a version of myself that lagged behind reality like a song with poor synchronization. The internet offered few answers. Discussions of mirror delays led primarily to technical explanations about digital displays, about the processing time required for electronic mirrors in cars or computers. But traditional mirrors, backed glass that worked through simple reflection of light, should have no delay at all. Light bounces from surface to surface instantaneously, creating immediate images that exist in perfect temporal harmony with their sources. Unless, somehow, my bathroom mirror had learned to live in yesterday. 2 weeks after I first noticed the delay, I began to observe more carefully what my reflection was doing during those half-second intervals when we existed in different moments. Sometimes my mirrored self seemed to hesitate before beginning the delayed motion, as if considering whether to follow my lead or chart its own course. Sometimes it appeared to be moving slightly differently. Then I was the angle of the head a degree or two off, the expression on the face not quite matching the expression I felt on my own face. I started leaving my phone's camera running during my morning routine, hoping to capture evidence of the delay, proof that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. But cameras, like other mirrors, showed only normal reflection. In the recorded videos, my mirror image moved in perfect synchrony with my actual movements. The delay existed only in real-time observation, only in the direct experience of standing before that particular mirror at that particular moment. The phenomenon seemed to respond to my attention. On mornings when I deliberately avoided looking at the mirror, when I brushed my teeth or washed my face without meeting my own eyes, the reflection seemed more normal, less temporally displaced. But when I watched carefully, when I tried to catch the delay in action, it became more pronounced, as if my focused observation was feeding the glitch, making it stronger and more defined. 3 weeks in, I noticed that my reflection was beginning to anticipate some of my movements. Not all of them, not the sudden or unexpected ones, but the routine gestures that formed the backbone of my morning habits. When I reached for the toothpaste, my reflection's hand would sometimes begin moving toward the tube before I had fully committed to the motion, as if it had learned my patterns and was trying to catch up to real time by predicting what would come next. This development was more unsettling than the original delay. Delayed reactions suggested a transmission problem, some interference in the normal flow of reflected light. But anticipatory movement suggested intelligence, awareness, the capacity for independent decision-making. It meant my reflection might not just be a late copy of myself, but a separate entity that shared my routine while living in its own temporal space. I began to vary my routine deliberately, brushing my teeth in different patterns, washing my face in unpredictable sequences, anything to see how my reflection would respond to genuine surprise. During these experiments, the half-second delay would return in full force, my mirrored self scrambling to catch up with actions it hadn't predicted, stumbling through unfamiliar sequences like an actor who had forgotten their lines. But in between these moments of confusion, I caught glimpses of something else in the mirror's surface, a quality of attention that seemed deeper than mere reflection, a sense that my mirrored self was watching me with the same curiosity I directed toward it. We were studying each other across that half-second gap, two versions of the same person separated by the smallest possible unit of time, learning each other's patterns and preferences and fears. A month after the delays began, I woke up one morning to find my reflection already waiting for me in the bathroom mirror. Not reflecting my presence, I hadn't entered the bathroom yet, but standing there independently, hands resting on the mirrored vanity, eyes fixed on the point where I would appear when I walked through the door. When I finally entered the bathroom, my reflection smiled and waved before I had decided to smile and wave back. The temporal relationship had reversed. Now my reflection was moving first. and I was the one lagging behind, following its lead like a dance partner who had forgotten the steps. The experience of being the delayed one was profoundly disorienting. I found myself waiting for my reflection to initiate movements, then copying what it did half a second later. My reflection seemed more confident now, more decisive, as if it had spent weeks studying my behavior and had concluded that it could perform the role of me more efficiently than I could. We fell into a routine where my reflection would demonstrate the morning sequence, reaching for the toothbrush, applying toothpaste, beginning the brushing motion, and I would follow along like a student learning choreography. It was strangely peaceful, or this surrender of initiative to my mirrored self. I no longer had to make decisions about the mundane details of morning hygiene. I simply had to watch and imitate, letting my reflection guide me through the familiar rituals with newfound precision and grace. But sometimes, when I looked carefully, I noticed that my reflection was performing the routine slightly differently than I would have. The toothbrush moved in more efficient patterns. The face washing technique was more thorough. The hair combing strategy produced better results. My reflection had been observing my habits for weeks and had developed improvements, refinements, optimizations that made the morning routine more effective. I began to wonder who was the real person and who was the reflection. In the traditional understanding, I was the original and the mirror showed a copy. But if the mirror's version was leading and I was following, if it was making better decisions and moving more efficiently, perhaps the relationship had inverted. Perhaps I had become the reflection of a more competent self that lived in the mirror's world. Half a second ahead of my own timeline. 6 weeks after the delays began, my reflection started showing me things that weren't in my bathroom. During the routine movements of morning preparation, I would catch glimpses of objects in the mirrored space that didn't exist in my physical space towels, hanging on hooks I didn't have, toiletries arranged on shelves that weren't mounted on my walls, lighting that seemed warmer and more flattering than the fluorescent fixture above my vanity. The mirrored bathroom was becoming a better version of my bathroom, just as my reflection had become a better version of myself. It was the same space but optimized, enhanced, perfected through the accumulated wisdom of weeks spent observing and improving upon the original design. I found myself envious of my reflection's environment. The mirror's bathroom had better organization, more thoughtful design, subtle improvements that suggested someone had been living there longer and had learned how to make the space truly functional. Plants thrived on windowsills that in my bathroom held only dust and forgotten bottles of expired medication. Soft rugs covered floor tiles that in my reality remained cold and bare. The temporal gap began to fluctuate. Some mornings the delay was barely perceptible. My reflection and I moving almost in unison like partners who had learned each other's rhythm. Other mornings the gap stretched longer, a full second, sometimes 2, and I would watch my reflection complete entire sequences of motion while I stood frozen, waiting for the synchronization to return. During the longer delays, I could observe my reflection more objectively, studying it as I might study a stranger. The face in the mirror had grown more confident over the weeks, more purposeful in its expressions. The posture was better, shoulders back, spine straight, movements economical and precise. My reflection had been practicing being me and had gotten better at the job than I was. 2 months in, my reflection began to show signs of independent thought that had nothing to do with morning routines. I would catch it pausing in the middle of brushing its teeth to stare at something beyond the mirror's frame, something in its world that didn't exist in mine. Sometimes it would nod, as if responding to a conversation I couldn't hear, or smile at some private amusement that belonged to its timeline rather than my own. These moments of independence were both fascinating and troubling. They suggested that my reflection had developed a life beyond its role as my temporal echo, that it was engaged in experiences and relationships that existed in the mirror's reality, but not in my physical space. I was no longer its primary focus. I was just one element in a richer, more complex existence that happened to include occasional sessions of synchronized morning preparation. The mirror itself began to change. The silver backing seemed deeper somehow, more luminous, as if it were not just reflecting light, but generating it from some internal source. The glass surface felt different beneath my fingertips when I cleaned it, warmer, smoother, somehow more alive than ordinary glass should be. It was becoming less like a mirror and more like a window, a portal between my reality and the enhanced version that existed half a second in the future. I started spending more time in front of the mirror, not just during morning routines, but throughout the day, studying the differences between my world and my reflection's world. The variations were subtle, but consistent, better lighting, more thoughtful arrangement of objects, an overall sense of harmony and purpose that my physical bathroom lacked. My reflection seemed pleased by the increased attention. When I lingered before the mirror, it would linger too, sometimes abandoning whatever independent activity had been occupying it to focus on our shared interaction. We developed a language of small gestures, tilted heads, raised eyebrows, slight smiles that conveyed meaning across the temporal divide. My reflection had become not just a better version of myself, but a separate person entirely, one who happened to share my appearance and my living space, but who experienced both in more refined ways. 3 months after the delays began, I noticed that my physical appearance was changing to match my reflection's improvements. My posture was straightening without conscious effort. My morning routine was becoming more efficient. My movements were gaining the same economy and precision I had been observing in the mirror. The temporal gap was closing not because my reflection was slowing down, but because I was speeding up, learning to inhabit my physical reality with the same competence my reflection had achieved in its enhanced version. But the mirror's improvements were outpacing my ability to match them. Each week brought new refinements to my reflection's world, better organization, more beautiful objects, a subtly enhanced lighting that made everything look more appealing. It was as if my reflection was living in a reality that was continuously upgrading itself, constantly becoming more perfect, while my physical world remained static and flawed. I began to wonder if I could cross over somehow, if the temporal gap might eventually become large enough for me to step through the mirror into that better timeline where my enhanced self lived with such apparent contentment. The glass surface felt increasingly permeable during our extended sessions, less like a barrier and more like a membrane that might be crossed with the right combination of intention and timing. The idea became an obsession. I would stand before the mirror for hours, pressing my palm against the glass, feeling for any sign of yielding, any suggestion that the boundary between realities was less solid than it appeared. My reflection would mirror these attempts, its hand pressed against the other side of the glass, both of us searching for a way to collapse the temporal distance that separated us. Sometimes, during these extended sessions, I could swear I felt warmth from my reflection's palm against mine, as if the glass were conducting not just light, but heat, emotion, intention. We were two versions of the same person trying to merge across impossible boundaries, each drawn to the other's timeline, each convinced that the other's reality was more complete than our own. 4 months after the delays began, I woke up one morning to find that my reflection was no longer in the bathroom mirror. The glass showed only my own immediate movements, perfectly synchronized, disappointingly normal. The enhanced bathroom was gone, replaced by the familiar imperfections of my actual space. The temporal gap had vanished, leaving me alone with my unimproved reality. I felt a profound sense of loss, as if I had been abandoned by my better self, left behind in a timeline that couldn't compete with the enhanced version my reflection had been inhabiting. The bathroom felt empty, in a way it never had before, lacking the presence that had shared the space for months, missing the companionship of someone who understood my routines and preferences better than I understood them myself. For weeks, I continued to stand before the mirror each morning, hoping to catch some sign of the temporal distortion, some hint that my reflection might return with its improved world and its patient guidance. But the mirror remained stubbornly normal, showing only immediate reflections of my increasingly desperate attempts to recreate the phenomenon that had become the most interesting relationship in my life. Gradually, I realized that the mirror hadn't abandoned me. I had learned everything it had been trying to teach. The improvements I had observed in my reflections world were now manifesting in my physical reality. I was standing straighter, moving more efficiently, organizing my space with the same thoughtful attention to detail I had admired in the mirrored bathroom. The temporal gap had closed not because my reflection had disappeared, but because I had finally caught up to its timeline. Now, months later, I sometimes catch glimpses of temporal displacement in other mirrors, a slight hesitation in a department store's changing room, a momentary lag in my car's rearview mirror, brief suggestions that somewhere, somewhen, other versions of myself are living in enhanced realities, learning to become better iterations of who I am. The bathroom mirror remains normal, showing immediate reflections that move in perfect synchrony with my movements. But sometimes, in the early morning light, when the angles are just right, I can see depths in the glass that suggest other possibilities, other timelines, other versions of myself still learning to inhabit reality with greater skill and wisdom. I've come to understand that the delayed reflection was not a glitch, but a gift, a chance to observe myself from outside the immediate present, to see how I might improve, to learn from a version of myself that had the benefit of living half a second in the future. The mirror taught me that identity is fluid, that we are always becoming rather than simply being. that the gap between who we are and who we might become is measured not in years or months, but in the smallest units of time, the spaces between heartbeats where transformation becomes possible. Tonight, as I prepare for sleep, I'll pause before the bathroom mirror one more time, grateful for the lessons it taught me, hopeful that somewhere in its depths, my enhanced reflection is still living its optimized life, still demonstrating that we are capable of becoming better than we imagine, 1/2 second improvement at a time. Story 10. The mirrors in elevator 17 have always been slightly wrong. Not broken, exactly, and not obviously distorted. Just subtly off in a way that makes you question your own perception. The reflection arrives a fraction of a second too late, or shows you adjusting your tie, when your hands are clearly at your sides. Small discrepancies that most people dismiss as tricks of fluorescent lighting or the vibrations of an aging building. I work on the 34th floor of the Meridian Tower, and I've been riding elevator 17 for 3 years now, long enough to become familiar with its particular quirks, the way it hesitates between floors 9 and 10, the soft grinding sound it makes when the doors open, the way the LED display sometimes flickers between floor numbers, as if it can't quite decide where it is. The mirrors line 3 walls of the elevator car, creating that infinity effect you see in fancy hotels. Endless reflections stretching away into impossible distances. Most people find it disorienting and look at their phones instead. But I've always been fascinated by the way the multiple reflections fragment and multiply reality, creating a visual echo chamber where small differences become amplified across the repetitions. That's probably why I was the first to notice the child. It was a Tuesday morning, rush hour. The elevator packed with the usual collection of office workers, delivery personnel, and building maintenance staff. I was pressed against the back wall, watching the floor numbers climb, when I caught a glimpse of something unusual in the mirror on the left wall. Among the reflected crowd of commuters, crouched in the corner where the back wall meets the side wall, was a small figure. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with pale skin and dark hair that hung in front of their face. They were wearing what looked like pajamas, striped cotton with a faded cartoon character. I couldn't quite make out. I looked directly at the corner where the child should have been. Empty space. Just the junction of 2 mirrored walls and the standard elevator carpeting. But when I looked back at the mirror, the child was still there, perfectly visible among the reflections of the other passengers, sitting quietly with their knees drawn up to their chest, small arms wrapped around their shins, rocking slightly back and forth with a motion so subtle it might have been mistaken for the natural sway of the elevator. I glanced around at the other passengers, expecting to see someone else looking confused or concerned, but everyone was absorbed in their phones, their newspapers, their private morning rituals of caffeine and contemplation. Either they couldn't see what I was seeing, or they'd become so accustomed to urban anonymity that a child crouching in an elevator corner didn't register as worth their attention. The elevator reached my floor. The doors opened with their familiar grinding whisper, and I stepped out with the small crowd of 30 fourth-floor workers. But as the doors slid closed, I turned back for one more look at the mirrors. The child was looking directly at me now, their face tilted up so I could see their eyes for the first time. Large, dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young face. They raised one small hand and waved, not the enthusiastic greeting of a child, but the slow, deliberate gesture of someone who has been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. I stood in the hallway for several minutes after the elevator had gone, staring at the closed doors and trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. Reflection without reality. A presence that existed only in the mirrored surfaces, invisible to direct observation, but perfectly clear in the recursive images that stretched away into infinity. That night, I researched the building's history, looking for any reports of missing children, tragic accidents, anything that might explain what I'd seen. The Meridian Tower was built in 1987, a standard commercial high-rise with nothing unusual in its construction or operation. No mysterious deaths, no unsolved disappearances, no reports of hauntings or supernatural phenomena. But I did find something interesting in the city records. A small apartment building had stood on this site before the tower was constructed. Built in the 1950s, it had housed working families, teachers, shop clerks, municipal employees, until it was condemned in the mid-1980s due to structural problems and poor maintenance. The last residents had been evacuated in 1986, and the building had been demolished shortly afterward to make way for the new tower. Standard urban renewal, nothing tragic or dramatic about it. Just the slow, inevitable process of old neighborhoods giving way to new development. But among the former residents listed in the final housing inspection report was a family named Chen. 2 parents and a 7-year-old child named Alex. The report noted that the family had been relocated to a different part of the city, but provided no forwarding address or further details. I wondered if Alex Chen had lived where Elevator 17 now carried passengers up and down 8 floors of gleaming office space. If the child I'd seen was somehow an echo of that displacement, a memory trace left behind when familiar spaces were erased and replaced with something entirely different. The next morning, I deliberately chose Elevator 17 instead of taking the stairs or waiting for one of the other cars. This time, I positioned myself where I could watch all 3 mirrored walls simultaneously, using the infinity reflections to expand my field of vision. The child was there almost immediately, not just crouched in the corner, but moving through the reflected space as if it were a playground. I watched them hop from one reflection to another, appearing to phase in and out of the different mirror surfaces like they were doorways or windows connecting parallel dimensions. In one reflection, the child sat on the floor playing with what looked like toy cars. In another, they stood pressed against the mirrored wall with their palms flat against the surface, as if trying to push through into the real elevator. In a third, they were drawing on the mirror with their finger, creating patterns that were visible in the reflection, but left no trace on the actual glass. I realized that the other passengers couldn't see any of this. They rode the elevator in blissful ignorance of the small figure, playing in their reflected midst, unaware that their mirrored selves were sharing the space with someone who existed only in the recursive images. But as the days passed, and I continued my morning observations, I began to notice that the child was having subtle effects on the reflected passengers. people would unconsciously adjust their posture, stepping slightly to one side or shifting their bags to the other shoulder, as if making room for someone they couldn't see, but somehow sensed. Others would glance at the mirrors with brief expressions of confusion, as if they'd caught a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision. The child seemed to enjoy these minor interactions. I watched them play gentle games with the oblivious passengers, carefully moving between their reflected legs, sitting quietly beside someone who was having a difficult day, or simply observing the adult world with the intense curiosity that children bring to everything they don't yet understand. But there was something profoundly lonely about their play. They were surrounded by people, but isolated within the mirror world, able to see and interact with reflections, but never able to make genuine contact with the living people those reflections represented. Last week, something changed. I was riding down from my floor, tired after a long day of meetings and deadlines, when I noticed the child sitting in their usual corner spot. But this time, instead of playing or drawing, they were simply watching me. Their dark eyes tracked my movement as I shifted position, followed my gaze as I looked around the elevator car. When I looked directly at them in the mirror, they pointed at their own chest, then at mine. Me, you. Then they pointed at the corner where they sat, the space that existed only in reflection. The message was clear. They wanted me to join them in the mirror world. I found myself stepping toward the corner, drawn by the child's patient invitation and my own growing curiosity about the nature of their existence. As I moved closer to the junction of the mirrored walls, my reflections multiplied and fractured, creating a kaleidoscope of images that seemed to fold in on themselves. The child smiled for the first time since I'd been observing them, a genuine expression of joy and relief, as if they'd been waiting years for someone to finally see them, to acknowledge their reality within the reflected space. I reached out toward the mirror, my palm approaching the glass surface, when the elevator suddenly lurched. The lights flickered. The floor numbers on the display scrambled into meaningless symbols, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something on the other side of the mirror were drawing me forward. For just a moment, I could swear I felt the child's small hand grasping mine, warm and solid and desperately alive. I could see my own reflection reaching back, our palms pressed together against opposite sides of the mirror surface. Then the elevator steadied, the lights returned to normal, and I was standing alone in the car, my hand pressed against cold glass that showed only my own confused face looking back at me. The child was gone. I've ridden elevator 17 every day since then, searching the mirrors for any sign of Alex Chen's presence. But the reflections show only what they should tired office workers, delivery personnel, maintenance staff, all going about their daily routines without awareness of the small tragedy playing out in their midst. Sometimes I think I catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, or notice that my reflection seems slightly out of sync with my actual movements. But when I look directly, there's nothing unusual to see. Just mirrors reflecting mirrors reflecting mirrors, creating an infinity of empty spaces where a lonely child once played games that no one else could see. I've started taking the stairs more often now. 30, 4 flights up, 30, 4 flights down. It's good exercise, I tell myself, and it saves time compared to waiting for an elevator. But the real reason is that I can't bear the thought of those empty mirrors, of a reflection world that has lost its only inhabitant. Yet sometimes, late at night, when I'm the last person leaving the office, I find myself standing in front of elevator 17, waiting for the doors to open, hoping to see that familiar small figure crouched in the corner, drawing invisible pictures on mirror surfaces that exist only in the space between reality and reflection. Because I think I understand now what happened during that moment when the elevator lurched and the lights flickered. The child wasn't trying to pull me into their world. They were trying to push through into mine, to cross the barrier that separated reflection from reality, mirror space from physical space. And for just an instant, we touched. Two lonely people reaching across the impossible divide between what is and what is reflected, between presence and echo, between the world of solid things and the world of infinite, empty repetitions. I wonder sometimes if Alex Chen made it through, if somewhere in the city, a 7-year-old child in faded pajamas is wandering streets they don't recognize, looking for the apartment building that was demolished 5 years ago, searching for parents who have long since grown old and moved on with their lives. Or maybe they're still there in the mirrors, waiting for someone else to see them, to acknowledge their existence in that strange space where light bounces back and forth between parallel surfaces, creating the illusion of depth where there is only reflection. Tonight, I'm going to ride elevator 17 one more time. I'm going to stand in that corner where the mirrors meet and create their infinity effect. And I'm going to look carefully at every reflection, every recursive image stretching away into impossible distances. And if I see a small hand pressed against the other side of the glass, if I catch a glimpse of dark eyes looking back at me from the reflected world, I'm going to place my palm against theirs and hold on tight. Maybe some barriers are meant to be crossed. Maybe some reflections are meant to become real. The elevator is waiting. The mirrors are clean and bright, ready to show me exactly what I need to see. The only question is, when I step inside and the doors close behind me, will I be riding alone, or will there be room for one more passenger in the space between what is and what is reflected? I think I'm ready to find out. Story 11. The apartment has 12 doors. I've counted them obsessively, the way you might count sheep or heartbeats, or the seconds between lightning and thunder. 12 doors, each one familiar, each one exactly where it should be. The front door with its triple locks and security chain. The bedroom door with the loose handle that rattles when the heat kicks on. The bathroom door that sticks in humid weather. The closet doors, the pantry door, the door to the utility closet where I keep my vacuum and Christmas decorations. 12 doors. Always 12 doors, except at night. It started 3 weeks ago, though I'm beginning to suspect it might have been happening longer without my noticing. The thing about living alone is that you develop routines, unconscious patterns that carry you through your days without requiring much attention. You learn to navigate your space in the dark, feet automatically avoiding the corner of the coffee table, hand reaching for light switches with muscle memory precision. But routines can blind you to changes, especially subtle ones that happen gradually, in the spaces between sleeping and waking. I first noticed the extra door on a Tuesday night when I got up for a glass of water. It was 20:17 a.m. I remember because I checked my phone, squinting at the blue glow and wondering if the insomnia was getting worse. The apartment was dark, except for the digital clock on the microwave and the faint orange streetlight that filters through my bedroom curtains. I padded barefoot down the hallway toward the kitchen, following the familiar path I've walked thousands of times. But something felt different. The hallway seemed longer somehow, as if an extra few feet had been inserted between my bedroom and the living room. My hand touched the wall, feeling for the thermostat that should have been right there, but found only smooth plaster. That's when I saw it. Between the bathroom door and the linen closet, where there should have been nothing but blank wall space and a framed photograph of my parents, stood another door. It was painted the same white as all the others, with the same brushed nickel handle, the same subtle wood grain texture. It looked like it had always been there, like it belonged as naturally as any of the other openings in my home. I stood there in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at this impossible addition to my living space. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. I was sleepwalking, dreaming, having some kind of neurological episode brought on by stress or medication or too much caffeine. But the door remained stubbornly solid, casting a faint shadow in the dim light from the street. I reached for the handle, then stopped. Something about the door felt wrong, beyond its mere existence. The air around it was cooler, as if a draft were seeping from underneath. And while all my other doors showed signs of normal wear, small scuffs from moving furniture, fingerprint smudges around the handles, this one was pristine, untouched by the casual damage of daily life. Instead of opening it, I turned on every light in the apartment and checked each room systematically. Everything else was exactly as it should be. My furniture, my belongings, my carefully arranged books and plants, all unchanged. The only difference was that 13th door, standing in the hallway like it had been waiting for me to notice it. By morning, it was gone. I woke up to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and the familiar sounds of the city coming to life. Traffic, construction, the occasional siren in the distance. The hallway looked exactly as it had for the 3 years. I'd lived here, 12 doors, proper spacing. The photograph of my parents hanging on the wall where it belonged. I measured the distance between the bathroom door and the linen closet with a tape measure. 7 feet, 3 inches. Exactly what it should be for the apartment's floor plan. I even checked the building's architectural drawings, which I'd received when I first signed my lease. No indication of any additional doorways or spaces unaccounted for. But that night, at 20:17 a.m., I got up for water again, and there it was, standing in the hallway like a patient sentinel. The 13th door. This time, I photographed it with my phone. The camera flash illuminated the hallway harshly, creating stark shadows and bleaching the white paint even whiter. But when I looked at the image afterward, it showed only the normal hallway. 12 doors, proper spacing, the photograph on the wall. Either the camera couldn't see what I was seeing, or I was losing my grip on reality. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. I've developed a new routine. over the past 3 weeks. Every night, I lie in bed listening for the subtle sounds that indicate the door's arrival. It's always the same, a soft creaking of floorboards, as if someone very light were walking through the hallway, followed by what might be the whisper of wood settling into place. The timing varies slightly, sometimes 2:17 a.m., sometimes 2:23, once as late as 2:45, but it always happens between 2 and 3 in the morning, during what researchers call the devil's hour, though I try not to think about that particular piece of folklore. After I hear the sounds, I wait exactly 5 minutes. Then I get up and walk to the hallway where the door is always waiting. It's become a ritual, this nightly confrontation with impossibility. I approach slowly, barefoot on the hardwood floor, noting how the temperature drops as I get closer to the door. My breath becomes visible sometimes, small puffs of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. The door itself never changes, same white paint, same brushed nickel handle, same pristine condition, but the space around it feels increasingly unstable, as if reality is wearing thin at that particular spot in my hallway. I've tried various experiments. I've placed objects in front of where the door appears. A chair, a small table, a stack of books. They're always moved aside come morning, arranged neatly against the opposite wall, as if someone with an obsessive attention to order had tidied up after me. I've tried staying awake all night to observe the door's appearance, but something always happens around 2 a.m. that makes me lose focus. A sudden wave of exhaustion. A phone call that turns out to be a robocaller with no one on the line. A mysterious noise from the kitchen that requires investigation. The door wants to be discovered only on its terms, during those liminal hours when the boundary between sleep and waking becomes permeable. Last week, I finally worked up the courage to touch the handle. The metal was so cold it nearly burned my palm, but I gripped it anyway, feeling the weight of the mechanism within. For a moment, I thought I could hear something on the other side. Not quite voices, but a kind of organized murmuring, like a conversation happening in a language just beyond the range of human comprehension. I turned the handle. It moved smoothly, clicking open with the same soft sound as any of my other doors. But when I pulled, it wouldn't budge. Not locked, exactly, but somehow sealed, as if the space beyond had been filled with invisible concrete. That's when I noticed something I'd missed during my previous observations. The bottom of the door showed no gap, no thin line of darkness indicating space beyond, no hint of different flooring or carpet. It was as if the door were mounted flush against solid wall, a prop door that led nowhere. But props don't generate cold drafts or move furniture or appear and disappear, according to their own mysterious schedule. 3 nights ago, something changed. I woke not to the subtle sounds of the door's arrival, but to the sound of it opening. The soft click of the handle, the whisper of hinges moving, the gentle sigh of air pressure equalizing. For the first time since this all began, someone or something was using the door. I lay in bed, paralyzed by a fear so complete it seemed to stop my heart. Footsteps moved through the hallway. Light, careful steps that seemed to barely disturb the floorboards. They approached my bedroom, paused outside the door, then continued toward the kitchen. After several minutes of silence, the footsteps returned, the same careful, measured pace, moving from the kitchen back toward the hallway. I heard the door open again, then close with that same soft click. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty. No 13th door, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. But in the kitchen, I found a glass of water sitting on the counter. The same glass I'd intended to get when I first discovered the door weeks ago, filled with cold water and placed exactly where I would have set it down. I didn't drink it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the building's history. Built in 1923, it had been a hotel originally, then converted to apartments in the 1960s. Nothing unusual in the records. No mysterious deaths, no unexplained disappearances, no reports of paranormal activity. Just a standard old building with the typical modifications and renovations you'd expect over nearly a century of use. But I did find something interesting in the architectural records. The original hotel layout showed 13 rooms on my floor, not 12, according to the 1923 blueprints. There should have been a small service room between what was now my bathroom and linen closet. A space for housekeeping supplies and laundry chutes that would have served the hotel guests. That room had been eliminated during the apartment conversion, its space absorbed into the adjacent units to create larger, more desirable living spaces. On paper, it no longer existed. The walls had been removed, the space redistributed, the doorway sealed up and painted over. But maybe some spaces don't want to stay eliminated. Maybe they remember their original purpose and occasionally reassert their right to exist. Last night, I prepared for what I somehow knew would be a different kind of encounter. I set up a camera in the hallway, positioned myself in the living room with a clear view down the corridor, and waited. At exactly 2:17 a.m., I heard the familiar creaking of floorboards. The door appeared as it always did, materializing between one moment and the next as if it had simply decided to stop hiding. But this time, as I watched, the handle began to turn on its own. The door swung open slowly, revealing not the solid wall or empty darkness I'd expected, but a space. A small, cramped room lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Shelves lined the walls, filled with the kind of supplies you'd expect in a hotel service room. Towels, cleaning products, spare linens. Everything looked decades old, but perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped in that small space sometime in the 1920s and never resumed. Standing in the center of the room, with her back to the door, was a woman in a hotel uniform. The kind of black dress with white apron that housekeeping staff wore in old movies, her gray hair pinned up in a neat bun. She was folding towels with mechanical precision, her movements repetitive and rhythmic. I wanted to call out to her, to ask who she was and what she was doing in my hallway at 2 a.m. But something about her posture, about the way she moved without any acknowledgement of the open door or my presence beyond it, made me stay silent. She wasn't folding towels for any practical purpose. She was caught in a loop, performing the same task over and over with the dedication of someone who couldn't remember how to stop. As I watched, she finished folding one towel, placed it precisely on a stack with the others, then picked up the same towel and began folding it again. Her movements never varied, never hesitated, never showed any awareness that she was repeating herself endlessly. The scene was hypnotic in its repetition, and I found myself settling into the rhythm of her actions. Fold, smooth, stack. Pick up, shake out, fold again. It was soothing, in a way. Watching someone so completely absorbed in their work, so undisturbed by questions of purpose or meaning. I don't know how long I stood there watching her. Time seemed as suspended as it was in her small, impossible room. But gradually, I became aware that she was slowing down. Her movements became more deliberate, more conscious, as if she were slowly remembering something important. Finally, she stopped folding and turned around. Her face was kind but tired, lined with the fatigue of decades of service. She looked at me without surprise, as if she'd been expecting me all along. When she spoke, her voice had the faint accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, though I couldn't place the origin. "The guests are sleeping," she said quietly. "They need their rest." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant. The building hadn't been a hotel for 60 years, and I was the only person living on this floor. She continued folding, but differently now. Not the mechanical repetition of before, but with purpose, preparing for some task that required fresh linens. "Room 13 has been vacant too long," she said, not looking up from her work. "The guests will be arriving soon." "What guests?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. She smiled, and for a moment her face showed not just kindness, but something like pity. "You, dear. You've been waiting such a long time." The room began to fade around her, the edges becoming indistinct, the light from the bare bulb growing dimmer. She continued folding towels as the walls dissolved, as the shelves became transparent, as the solid floor beneath her feet turned to mist. "The door will stay now," she said, her voice echoing from increasingly far away. "Room 13 needs its door." And then she was gone. And the small service room was gone. And I was standing alone in my hallway looking at empty space where the 13th door had been. But the door didn't disappear with the morning light this time. It's still there now as I write this, standing open to reveal what looks like a perfectly ordinary converted closet space. The kind of small room you might use for storage, or as a tiny office, or simply leave empty because you don't have enough belongings to fill every space in your home. The air no longer carries that strange chill. The handle is warm to the touch, worn smooth in the places where hands have gripped it over the decades. When I step inside, my footsteps sound normal, solid, real. I think I understand now what's been happening. The door wasn't appearing. It was returning. Room 13 has been trying to re-establish itself, to reclaim its place in the building's architecture and memory. The woman in the hotel uniform wasn't a ghost in any traditional sense, but rather the echo of purpose itself, the concentrated intention of decades of service that had become self-sustaining. She'd been maintaining the room all these years, keeping it ready for guests who would never come, folding towels that would never be used, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had been lost when the walls came down and the space was redistributed. By seeing the door, by recognizing its right to exist, I'd given it permission to stop hiding. Room 13 doesn't need to be a service room anymore. My apartment has no hotel guests requiring fresh linens and housekeeping services. But it needed to be something, to have some purpose that justified its reclaimed existence. I've been thinking about what that purpose might be. A study, perhaps, or a meditation room. a space for the kinds of activities that require solitude and contemplation. Or maybe just an empty room where I can sit quietly and listen to the sounds of the building settling around me, to the whispers of all the lives that have been lived within these walls. The door is staying open for now. I like the way it changes the flow of the hallway, creates new angles and shadows that make the familiar space feel larger, more complex. It's remarkable how much difference a single doorway can make. How it alters not just the physical space, but the sense of possibility within it. Tonight, I won't be counting 12 doors. I'll be counting 13, as it should be, as it was always meant to be. And maybe, in the quiet hours before dawn, I'll hear the soft sounds of someone moving through the building. Not the careful steps of a woman caught in temporal loops, but the natural rhythms of a space that has finally remembered how to be at peace with itself. Room 13 is open now. The question is, what kind of guest will I choose to be? A story 12. The house had been in my family for 3 generations, though I'd never lived in it until now. The inheritance came with dust, covered memories, and the peculiar smell of old wood and forgotten time. I moved in on a Tuesday, when the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows just right, making everything seem almost welcoming. The moving truck had left hours ago, and I stood in the front parlor, surveying the scattered boxes and the furniture that had been there long before I was born. That's when I first noticed the rocking chair. It sat in the corner by the window, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with intricate carvings along its arms and back. The wood was dark with age, polished to a soft gleam that caught the dying light. I ran my fingers along its surface, feeling the smooth grain beneath my palm. The chair felt warm, though the house was cool from sitting empty for so long. That first night, I fell asleep to the sound of settling wood and the whisper of wind through old window frames. But somewhere in the depths of sleep, I heard it, a gentle, rhythmic creaking. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound was soft, almost soothing, like a lullaby made of wood and motion. I woke to silence. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the parlor windows, and the rocking chair sat perfectly still. I examined it closely, running my hands over every joint and connection. The craftsmanship was flawless. Each piece fitted together with the precision that only comes from true artistry. When I sat in it myself, it rocked smoothly, the motion fluid and natural. The cushion faded but still soft, seemed to conform to my body as if it remembered the shape of whoever had sat there before. But that night I heard it again. Creak, creak, creak! The sound drifted up through the floorboards, steady and patient. I lay in bed, listening, counting the rhythm. 12 rocks forward, 12 rocks back, then silence for exactly 30 seconds before beginning again. I found myself timing my breathing to match the pattern, my heartbeat slowly synchronizing with the ghostly motion below. On the third night, I decided to investigate. I crept down the stairs, bare feet silent on the worn wooden steps, my hand trailing along the smooth banister. The house seemed to hold its breath around me, shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. The parlor door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see the chair. It was moving, back and forth, with the same steady rhythm I'd been hearing. But it was empty. The cushion showed no indentation, no sign that anyone sat there. yet it rocked with purpose, as if invisible hands guided its motion. I stood transfixed, watching the hypnotic movement, feeling my own body sway slightly in response. The moonlight streaming through the window created shifting patterns on the floor, and in those patterns I began to see shapes. A woman's silhouette, perhaps, or the suggestion of one. The shadows seemed to gather around the chair, coalescing into something almost substantial before dissolving back into darkness. I stepped into the room, and the rocking stopped immediately. The chair sat motionless, innocent, as if it had never moved at all. But the air still held the echo of motion, a disturbance that made the hair on my arm stand up. I approached slowly, my feet silent on the old carpet, and placed my hand on the chair's arm. It was warm, not just warm from the day's heat, but warm as if someone had just been sitting there, their body heat still radiating from the wood and fabric. I pulled my hand away, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth. From that night forward, the chair rocked every evening. I began to anticipate it, to listen for the first creak that would signal the beginning of its nightly ritual. Sometimes I would sit on the stairs, just out of sight, and watch through the gap in the door. The motion never varied 12 rocks forward, 12 back, 30 seconds of stillness, then again. I researched the chair's history, digging through old family documents and photographs. In a picture from 1952, I found it in the same corner of the same room. A woman sat in it, her face turned toward the camera with a gentle smile. My grandmother's sister, Eleanor, who had lived in the house until her death in 1987. She had never married, never had children. The house had been her entire world. In another photograph, this one from 1973, Eleanor sat in the chair again, but something was different. Her eyes seemed distant, unfocused, as if she were looking at something beyond the camera's view. Her hands rested on the chair's arms in exactly the same position I had unconsciously adopted when I sat there myself. The rocking became a nightly comfort, strange as it sounds. I would lie in bed, listening to the gentle rhythm, and feel a sense of peace wash over me. It was as if Eleanor were still there, keeping watch, maintaining the routines that had structured her life for so many years. The sound became part of my sleep, woven into my dreams like a lullaby. But as weeks passed, I began to notice changes in myself. I found myself drawn to the parlor during the day, sitting in the chair for hours at a time, rocking slowly back and forth. The motion was soothing, almost hypnotic. Time seemed to compress and expand around me, minutes stretching into hours or disappearing entirely. I began to understand the rhythm 12 rocks, forward to bring the memories closer, 12 rocks back to push them away, 30 seconds of stillness to let them settle like dust motes in sunlight. Forward for the past, back for the present, stillness for the space between them where truth lies. My reflection in the window began to look different as I rocked. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I could see Eleanor sitting beside me, her own gentle motion matching mine. We were both there, both not there, existing in the spaces between seconds, between breaths, between the forward and backward motion of time itself. The house grew quiet around us, settling into routines that had been established long before I arrived. The creaking of the chair became the heartbeat of the place, the rhythm that kept everything in balance. Understood now why Eleanor had never left, why she had chosen to remain here, even after her death. The chair held everything: memory, comfort, continuity. Friends called, but I found it difficult to leave the house. The world outside seemed harsh and jarring after the gentle rhythm of the parlor. The chair called to me, its warm wood and soft cushion promising peace and understanding. Eleanor was there, always there, a presence felt rather than seen, guiding my movements, sharing her knowledge of how to exist between moments. I began to lose track of time entirely. Was it morning or evening? Had I been rocking for minutes or hours? The light in the room seemed constant, neither growing nor fading, suspended in an eternal afternoon that belonged neither to day nor night. My body moved without conscious thought, forward and back, following the pattern that had been set long before my arrival. The mailbox filled with uncollected letters. The phone rang unanswered. Food remained untouched in the kitchen. But in the parlor, the rhythm continued, steady and sure. Eleanor and I rocked together, two occupants of the same chair, the same moment, the same endless, gentle motion. Sometimes I wondered if I was becoming like her, choosing to remain in this place of comfort and routine, rather than face the harsh uncertainties of the world beyond these walls. But the thought would drift away on the next rock forward, dissolving in the warmth of the wood and the softness of the cushion. The chair knows things, I think. It remembers everyone who has sat in it, everyone who has found solace in its embrace. It holds their impressions, their warmth, their need for comfort and continuity. Eleanor is there, and now I am there too, and perhaps someday someone else will join us, adding their own rhythm to the eternal rocking. Forward for memory, back for peace, stillness for the space between heartbeats where everything is possible and nothing ever ends. The chair rocks, and I rock with it, and somewhere in the motion, I understand that I have found exactly where I belong. The light in the parlor never changes now, and I no longer count the hours or the days. There is only the rhythm, the gentle creak of well-oiled wood, and the warmth of presence both seen and unseen. The house breathes around us, its old walls holding our secrets, and in the rocking chair by the window, we continue our eternal dance with time itself. Forward and back, in the space between seconds where love and memory live forever.